The door locked from the outside, and three retired Special Operations war dogs, each one capable of breaking a man's arm in under a second, turned to face the woman alone in the room with them. The handlers outside went rigid. These animals had hospitalized two trainers in the past month. They didn't trust strangers. They didn't tolerate civilians. But within 15 seconds of the lock clicking shut, all three dogs moved toward the woman in the nurse's scrubs. And instead of attacking, they formed a protective triangle around her, ears forward, bodies still, waiting for her command like soldiers awaiting orders from the one officer they had never forgotten. If this story already has you leaning forward, you're exactly where you need to be. Follow this channel all the way to the end, hit like, and drop a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The morning started the way most mornings did at Harwell Veterans Medical Center, with the smell of burnt coffee, a broken elevator on the third floor, and Dr. Phillip Creed already in a bad mood before 8 o'clock. Creed was the kind of man who filled a room without meaning to. Not because he was particularly tall or loud, but because he moved through hospital corridors like he owned the walls, and over 11 years as the emergency department director at Harwell, most of the staff had quietly accepted that he kind of did. He had the build of someone who had played college football and never quite let it go, a voice that carried without effort, and a habit of CCing the hospital administrator on emails that didn't require it, just to make sure everyone knew he was paying attention. He did not like Lena Voss. That wasn't entirely accurate. Creed didn't think about Lena Voss enough to dislike her the way a person dislikes something that bothers them. She was just there, the way a chair is there, or a fire extinguisher mounted near a door. She showed up on time, did her work without complaint, and never pushed back. She was, in Creed's private estimation, exactly the kind of nurse a department could depend on to fill a schedule gap and nothing more. Lena had worked the trauma floor at Harwell for 3 years. 31 years old, medium height, unremarkable brown hair that she always kept clipped back during shifts, and the kind of quiet that people in busy hospitals sometimes mistook for shyness. She wasn't shy. She was careful. There was a difference, though most people who had dismissed her over the years had never thought long enough about it to notice. She had requested a trauma team lead position twice. Both times Creed had passed her over, once for a nurse with more visible seniority, once for a travel nurse who left 4 months later. When Lena had asked, the second time, for a formal review of her application, Creed had nodded in the way that meant he was already thinking about something else. "You're good where you are, Voss," he'd said. "We need reliable people on the floor. That's not a small thing." She hadn't argued. She'd said, "Understood," and gone back to her shift. That was the moment Creed had decided she wasn't a problem. Compliant people weren't problems. They were conveniences. What he hadn't noticed, what nobody in the administrative wing of Harwell had noticed, was that Lena Voss read people the way a mechanic reads an engine. Quietly, systematically, without announcing conclusions until she was sure of them. She had been watching Creed for 3 years. She knew which nurses he called by first name and which ones he addressed by title. She knew he took the long route to the break room on days when he wanted to avoid the charge nurses. She knew that when he dropped an unwanted task on a junior staff member, he always framed it as an opportunity. The morning the K9 unit arrived at Harwell, Creed used the word opportunity 3 times before 9 o'clock. The dogs came in a military transport van, black, no markings beyond a small insignia on the rear panel, and were unloaded into the hospital's side entrance by 2 handlers in camouflage. 3 Belgian Malinois, not German Shepherds. Their names were stenciled on their vest patches, Delta, Sable, and Rex. All 3 had served with a special operations unit out of Fort Lassen, 200 miles north of Harwell in the Montana Hills. All 3 had sustained injuries, Delta, a shrapnel wound to the left shoulder that had healed wrong, Sable, nerve damage in her rear left leg, Rex, a torn ligament, and something the veterinary notes described as significant trauma response, which was the clinical term for a dog that had seen too much and wasn't handling it well. They were being evaluated for a civilian rehabilitation program that Harwell was piloting, partly because the VA had pushed for it, partly because the hospital's PR department understood what a story like Veterans Hospital Rehabilitates War Dogs did for donor relations. Whatever the reason, the program was real, the dogs were real, and the evaluation was scheduled for the hospital's physical rehabilitation room on the second floor. The military liaison officer who accompanied them was a man named Major Derek Caulfield, compact, precise, and visibly unhappy about the whole arrangement. He had made clear, in the pre-visit documentation, that the dogs were not to be handled by anyone without proper clearance, and that evaluation sessions were to be supervised by military personnel at all times. Creed had read that documentation and promptly decided it was a guideline, not a restriction. "I need someone from trauma nursing to sit in on the intake evaluation," he told the morning charge nurse, Bev Harlan, at 8:45. "Familiar face, calm demeanor. Make the environment feel less clinical." He paused. "Voss. She's good with the quiet stuff." Bev had looked at him for a moment. The military liaison specified trained handlers only. "It's an evaluation, not a procedure. Voss will observe. She won't interact with the animals." He said animals the way people say furniture. "Tell her it's a development opportunity." There it was. Lena heard about the assignment secondhand. Bev came to find her in the supply room where she was restocking a crash cart, and to Bev's credit, she looked uncomfortable delivering the message. "Creed wants you in the K9 intake evaluation at 9:30, second floor rehab room." Bev paused. "You can say no. I'll back you up." Lena considered that for a moment. Then she said, "What's the dog's background?" Bev blinked. Special Ops unit out of Fort Lassen, I think. They're doing a rehab pilot program." "Fort Lassen." Lena kept her voice even. "Okay, I'll be there." Bev left looking like she'd expected a different answer. Lena finished restocking the cart, replaced the defibrillator pads in their slot, and checked her watch. She had 37 minutes. She used 12 of them standing in the stairwell with her phone, pulling up what public records existed on the Fort Lassen Special Operations Medical Attachment. Not because she needed to verify anything, because she wanted to know what shape the next hour was going to take before she walked into it. The rehab room was large and deliberately neutral. Pale walls, rubber flooring, minimal equipment to reduce visual stimulation. When Lena arrived at 9:28, Major Caulfield was already there with his 2 handlers, and the 3 dogs were secured in separate sections of the room, each one watching the door with the particular alertness of animals that had spent years treating every new person as a potential threat assessment. Caulfield took one look at Lena's scrubs and turned to find Creed. Creed arrived 40 seconds later, already talking. "Major Caulfield, this is Lena Voss. She's one of our most experienced trauma nurses. She'll observe from the corner, completely passive, just to give us a civilian medical perspective on the behavioral intake." "The agreement was handlers only in the evaluation space," Caulfield said. He wasn't rude about it. He was precise about it. "And you have your handlers. Lena is here in a medical observation capacity. The dogs don't need to interact with her." Caulfield looked at Lena. Lena looked at the dogs. Delta had stopped watching the door. He was watching her. "I can step out if you'd prefer," she said. Neutral, clean, no push in her voice. Caulfield studied her for a moment longer than the situation seemed to require. Then he said, "You can stay. Corner only, no approach, no eye contact with Rex. He's the one on the right." "Understood." Creed smiled the smile of a man who had gotten what he wanted without effort and was already thinking about the next thing. He stood near the observation window in the door, a long strip of reinforced glass that let people in the corridor see into the room, and crossed his arms in the way he did when he was waiting to look like he'd orchestrated something. The evaluation began. The handlers ran Delta and Sable through basic mobility assessments, gait analysis, response to command, tolerance of clinical touch. Delta was reluctant but manageable. Sable was easier, intelligent, and patient, compensating visibly for the weakness in her left leg. Rex sat at the far end of the room and watched everything with the fixed attention of a dog that hadn't decided yet whether the day was going to require him to react. Lena stood in the corner and did not move. She didn't look away from the dogs, though. She watched them the way she watched patients, not for what they showed, but for what they were working to control. Delta's weight shifted left when his right shoulder was touched, even lightly. Sable favored the leg less when she was focused on a task, which meant the nerve damage responded to distraction, useful. Rex hadn't relaxed once since Lena had entered the room, but he also hadn't aggressed. He was tracking her without flagging her as a threat. which was a distinction most people in this room probably weren't registering. She registered it. The evaluation ran for 20 minutes without incident. Then one of the handlers, the younger one, maybe 24, a specialist named Trent, according to his patch, bent to examine Sable's rear leg at an angle that put his face within 6 inches of her flank without warning her first. Sable's head snapped around. Not a bite, but a warning. Ears flat, teeth briefly visible, a sound low in her throat that wasn't quite a growl. The specialist jerked back. Rex came off his haunches. Lena said, "Rex, fuss." The room went very still. Rex stopped, turned his head toward her, and sat back down. Caulfield had been facing the window. He turned slowly and looked at Lena with an expression she recognized. Not anger, not confusion, something sharper and more careful than both of those things. "Where did you learn that command?" he said. The word she'd used wasn't in the dog's public training records. She knew that because she'd looked 12 minutes ago in the stairwell. The command was legacy, older than the current certification protocols, used by units that had been restructured and redesignated several times over the past decade. It was the kind of thing you knew because you'd been there, not because you'd read about it. "Training," she said, which was true and not an explanation. Creed from the doorway said, "See? That's what I mean. Good instincts." He said it like he was crediting himself for bringing her. Caulfield didn't look at Creed. He kept his eyes on Lena. "Which unit?" She held his gaze for 1 second. Then she said, "I'm a trauma nurse, Major. I think your specialist should let Sable reset before continuing the physical assessment." Caulfield was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Agreed," and redirected his handlers. But he didn't stop watching her. The rest of the evaluation ran without incident. When it concluded, the handlers began preparing to move the dogs to the temporary holding space that had been arranged on the ground floor. Creed, who had apparently grown bored with observing, had already left to handle something else, and a nursing assistant had been sent to retrieve Lena for a regular floor task, which is when the hospital's emergency alert system went off. Not the standard overhead tone, the critical alarm, the one that meant structural incident, mass casualty, or both. 3 ascending tones followed by a recorded instruction. "All available personnel, report to the main entrance. Emergency response required. All available personnel." Lena was already moving before the 3rd repetition. She hit the corridor at a fast walk that was almost a run. Not running because running in hospitals created secondary problems, but moving with the kind of efficiency that didn't waste a step. The stairwell was faster than the elevator, always. She took it 2 stairs at a time. The scene outside the main ambulance entrance was worse than the alarm had suggested. A delivery truck, one of the heavy commercial vehicles that serviced the hospital's loading bay, had veered off the approach ramp and hit the covered ambulance alcove at enough speed to bring down a section of the steel canopy and one of the support columns. The collapse had caught the ambulance bay mid-shift. 1 ambulance crew was still there, one of their rigs partially pinned, and at least 4 people were visible in the wreckage. 2 veterans who had been using the accessible entrance ramp, an EMT who'd been unloading supplies, and the truck driver whose cab was compressed against the concrete barrier. The secondary problem was that a gas line had been nicked somewhere in the collapse. Nobody was saying fire risk out loud, but the smell was already present and getting stronger. The first hospital staff to reach the scene were 2 orderlies and a resident named Dr. Marcus Webb, who was good under pressure but had never managed a multi-casualty trauma in the field. Webb was already calling for gurneys and trying to organize the small group of bystanders into something useful. But bystanders in a crisis are rarely useful, and he had 4 critical situations unfolding simultaneously. Lena assessed the scene in approximately 4 seconds. Truck driver, cab crush, probable bilateral leg fractures, conscious but compromised airway from the airbag impact. EMT, down near the rig's rear wheel, head wound, moving but disoriented. Veteran 1, elderly man, oxygen tank still attached to his chair, pinned under a section of canopy steel but alert and terrified. Veteran 2, the one that made her move faster, a younger man, maybe 40, who was partially under the collapsed support column and not moving. "Webb," she said. Not loud, just direct. He turned. He'd been a resident for 8 months. He recognized the tone. "Airway on the truck driver first. He's going to aspirate blood if nobody stabilizes his head position. Use whoever you can to hold manual stabilization. Don't move him. Send 1 person for the EMT. She's ambulatory." She was already crouching toward the younger veteran as she said it. This one's my priority. Voss, you don't have equipment? Then get me equipment. She didn't say it sharply. She said it the way you say things when there isn't time for anything except the next correct action. And Webb, to his credit, turned and started directing people because she had already given him a structure he could operate inside. The younger veteran's name tag, visible on his jacket, said T. Murrow. He was breathing, which was the first thing she confirmed. His pulse was present at the carotid, which was the second thing. The column had caught him across the lower torso and his left arm, pinning rather than crushing, but the angle was bad and the debris above him wasn't stable. She could see the way the secondary pieces were balanced, a visual calculus that took about a second. And she knew that moving him without addressing the instability above first would bring more weight down. She needed three things: someone to monitor his airway, someone to stabilize the upper debris, and a backboard. She heard footsteps behind her and looked back. Delta was there, then Sable, then Rex. They hadn't been secured. Caulfield was 10 feet behind them, not trying to call them back, just watching. The two handlers were on either side of him. None of them were interfering. Rex moved to the left side of the debris pile and stopped, his nose working the air. Then he looked back at Lena and held the position. There was no formal command for what he was doing. What he was doing was older than commands. He was working. He'd found something and he was waiting for direction. "What's he indicating?" she said without looking away from Murrow. Caulfield's voice came from behind her. "There's someone else in there." She turned. Rex was fixed on a section of debris that had been compressed against the sidewall, a blind spot from the main angle of approach. Invisible unless you were standing where Rex was standing. The section had been a storage alcove. It was now collapsed. Another person. "Webb!" She raised her voice. "We have a secondary casualty behind the east wall section. Rex has the location. Trust him. Follow his indication." Webb looked at a military dog like a man being asked to trust a military dog for the first time in his life. Then he looked at the way Rex was holding position and went. The next 40 minutes were this kind of controlled chaos that either broke people or revealed them. Lena worked Murrow's stabilization with a nursing assistant holding manual spinal precautions while she coordinated the debris shift with two orderlies under Caulfield's direction. Caulfield himself turned out to know exactly how to manage structural load sequencing without being asked, which she filed away. The person Rex had located behind the east wall was a hospital kitchen worker named Petra, who had been passing through the loading bay on her way to the service entrance. She was alive, had a closed femur fracture and a scalp lac, and was terrified and certain she was dying. She was not dying. The truck driver's airway was stabilized by Webb. The EMT recovered orientation and was able to identify her own injuries: right wrist fracture, probable concussion, and was sitting against a wall drinking water by the time the fire department arrived. Murrow came out of the debris on a proper backboard, pulse still present, responsive to voice by the time they had him on a surface. Lena was on her knees beside him when she heard Creed arrive. She heard him before she saw him. That carrying voice, moving through the crowd that had gathered, saying something about coordinating with the trauma team. Then she heard him stop. She looked up. Creed was standing 10 feet away, looking at the scene in front of him. At Webb following Lena's framework. At the three military dogs positioned around the work zone, like a perimeter that nobody had asked them to form. At Major Caulfield standing to Lena's left, in a posture that, if you understood anything about military bearing, was not the posture of a man who was observing. It was the posture of a man waiting on someone else's lead. Creed's expression was the expression of a person who has walked into a room and found that all of the furniture has been rearranged in a way that makes more sense than how they had it, and they cannot explain why that bothers them. "Voss," he said, "this is a mass casualty response. You should be upstairs on the trauma floor." "I'm the first medical responder on scene," she said, without looking up from Murrow's left radial pulse. "The trauma team has been notified, ETA 4 minutes. I'm maintaining until handoff." "I'm the ER director." "Creed," Caulfield's voice, even, not aggressive. "Let her finish." Something passed across Creed's face that she didn't look up in time to see, but she felt the silence that came after it. The particular silence of a room where a man has been told to stand down in front of people he'd expected to be deferring to him. The trauma team arrived 3 minutes and 40 seconds later. Lena handed off Murrow's case to Dr. Sylvia Brandt, the senior trauma attending, with a clean verbal report: mechanism of injury, Vitals progression, spinal precautions in place, no administered medications, suspected internal hemorrhage secondary to column compression. Brant listened with the full attention of someone who had received handoffs from a lot of different people and could tell within the first sentence whether the person giving the report knew what they were doing. Brant looked at Lena once, quick, like a reassessment of something she'd already categorized. "Good catch on the internal," she said. Then she was moving. Lena stood up. Her knees were dirty. Her left hand had a cut across the palm from a piece of debris she didn't remember. She'd been wearing nitrile gloves, but something had gone through. It wasn't serious. She pressed it against her thigh. Caulfield was standing 3 feet away. "Voss?" he said. She looked at him. He wasn't asking a question. He was looking at her the way people look at something they recognized late, that particular mix of confirmation and regret. "Fort Lassen," he said. "You said training. I'm asking again." She held his gaze. Behind him, Rex, Delta, and Sable were sitting in a loose triangle with their attention fixed on her. Not on the scene, not on the arriving paramedics, not on the fire department crews now working the gas line. On her. "I need to go document my response actions," she said. Caulfield didn't stop her. But as she walked back toward the hospital entrance, she heard him say something to one of his handlers in a low voice. She didn't catch the words. She didn't need to. She walked through the automatic doors, past the gathering staff who hadn't been in the crisis, past a wide-eyed nursing student who pressed herself against the wall to let Lena by, and up the stairs to the second floor, where the trauma nursing station was, where she could find a quiet corner and write the incident report before her hands started doing what hands sometimes did after adrenaline left a person's system. She was halfway through the incident report, clear, organized, clinical, when the charge station phone rang. Bev picked it up, listened for a moment, and then set the handset down and turned to look across the station at Lena with the expression of someone who has just received news they weren't expecting. "Hospital administration," Bev said. "Director Marfeld wants you in her office." Lena saved her report and stood up. "Also," Bev said, and her voice had gone quieter, "Major Caulfield is already there." Lena picked up her badge from the desk where she'd set it, clipped it back onto her scrub collar, and walked to the elevator. On the second floor, through the long corridor window that overlooked the now-cleared ambulance bay, she could see Creed standing near the emergency entrance. He was talking to someone from facilities management. His arms were moving in the way they moved when he was explaining something he hadn't caused but was claiming authority over. He hadn't noticed her in the window. He also hadn't noticed that Major Caulfield had left his side of the scene nearly 15 minutes ago. Lena pressed the button for the 4th floor, where Director Marfeld's office was. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. As the doors closed, she heard, from somewhere down the corridor, impossible to place precisely, maybe from the open door of the rehab room that still hadn't been properly resecured, a sound. Low. Steady. 3 dogs breathing in unison. She pressed 4. The elevator rose. And somewhere behind the closing doors, in a hospital that had spent 3 years treating her like a useful piece of furniture, the floor had started to shift in a way that no one had seen coming, least of all the man who had put her in that room to begin with. The 4th floor of Harwell Veterans Medical Center was quieter than the rest of the building. Carpeted hallways, lower ceilings, the kind of institutional stillness that accumulated in places where decisions got made behind closed doors. Lena had been up here twice before. Once when she'd submitted her second application for the trauma lead position, and once when she'd filed a formal concern about medication documentation practices in the overnight rotation. Both times she had sat in a waiting area outside Director Marfeld's office for 20 minutes before being seen. This time, the administrative assistant waved her straight through. Director Nora Marfeld was a small woman in her late 50s who had the posture of someone who had sat across a table from difficult people for decades and had stopped flinching at anything. Her office was tidy in the way that suggested she cleaned it herself rather than leaving it to someone else. A single plant on the windowsill, not thriving, but not dead, which seemed about right for the amount of sunlight the north-facing window provided. Major Caulfield was already seated. He hadn't taken the chair closest to the door, which Lena noted without commenting on. He'd taken the one angled toward the window, the one that let him see both the entrance and the room at once. Old habit. "Sit down, Lena," Marfeld said, not unkindly. Lena sat. Marfeld looked at her for a moment with the particular attention of someone assembling information they'd received from multiple directions and trying to align it into a single picture. Then she said, "Major Caulfield has requested that we discuss this morning's events, specifically your involvement in the K9 evaluation and your response to the ambulance bay incident." She paused. "He's also raised a question about your background that I have to be honest with you. I didn't have an answer to." Lena looked at Marfeld, then at Caulfield. Caulfield said, "I've been making calls for the past hour and a half." "I assumed you would," Lena said. "Your nursing license is current. Your employment history with Harwell checks out. Everything from 2021 forward is exactly what it should be." He paused. "Before that, there's a gap, 4 years. And before the gap, your records are partially restricted under a clearance designation that I wasn't able to access from a hospital conference room." He said it without accusation, just layout. "What I was able to confirm is that the unit designation attached to your restricted file matches the operational history of the dogs downstairs." The room was quiet. Marfeld's pen was resting on the desk, untouched. "This is voluntary," Marfeld said. "I want to be clear about that. You're not in a disciplinary proceeding. You're not being asked to justify yourself to anyone in this room. But I think you understand that this morning created questions that are going to get answered one way or another." Lena considered that for a moment. The cut on her palm had stopped bleeding. She could feel it had closed, a small tightness across the base of her fingers. She hadn't bandaged it yet. "I served as a special operations medical specialist for 6 years, she said. "The last 3 were with a classified forward surgical attachment that worked alongside special mission units in operational environments. Fort Lassen ran one of those units. I worked alongside the K9 teams during 3 deployments." Caulfield said, "Delta, Sable, and Rex were operational during the last 2 of those deployments." "Yes." Marfeld exhaled slowly, not a sigh. More the breath of someone who has been carrying a smaller version of the room they're actually standing in. "Why didn't this appear anywhere in your hospital application?" Marfeld asked. "It appears exactly as much as my clearance level allows it to, which is not very much." Lena kept her voice even. "I didn't conceal anything. I disclosed military service, specialty medical training, and the operational gap as required. The specifics are restricted. That's not my decision. That's how the classification works." "But you chose not to volunteer it." "I chose to apply as a trauma nurse," Lena said, "which is what I am. I didn't see what the rest of it added." Caulfield made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Not dismissive. Something more complicated than that. "That command you used this morning, fuss. You know what that is? It's a HEAL command from an older German origin protocol. The current certification programs don't use it. The Fort Lassen teams used it during a specific operational period. The only people who know that command outside of that specific unit are the handlers who were there and the one medic who worked alongside the teams long enough for the dogs to transfer command response." He stopped. "That's you." "That's me." Marfeld picked up her pen, set it down again. "Major, what is it you're looking for here? Because I need to understand what this meeting is actually about." Caulfield looked at Marfeld directly. "This morning, Ms. Voss managed a multi-casualty trauma response in a compromised structural environment without equipment, without authorization, and without backup. And the outcome was 4 living people instead of 1 or 2. She did it correctly. Not impressively, not dramatically, correctly." He said the word with the particular emphasis of someone who understood the difference. "In my experience, correct performance under those conditions doesn't come from nursing school. It comes from repetition in bad environments." He looked at Lena. "I want to know who authorized leaving her alone in a room with 3 restricted military working dogs." The quality of the room's silence shifted. Marfeld said, "That would be Dr. Creed." "I know who it would be. I want it documented." Marfeld's expression was careful and very still. "You're asking me to open an internal review. I'm telling you that I will be filing a report with my commanding officer about this morning's events, regardless of what Harwell does internally. What you do with that information is your business." He paused. "But you should know. Dr. Creed was informed 3 times in the pre-visit documentation that the K9 evaluation space was restricted to authorized handlers. He was informed once verbally, this morning, by me. He overrode that restriction to place a civilian staff member in the evaluation space without disclosing her purpose or role to my team." He kept his voice flat, informational. One of those dogs has a documented trauma response profile. If he had reacted to the environment this morning the way he reacted 2 weeks ago during a handler evaluation, that nurse would have been seriously injured. Lena said, Rex didn't react that way. No, Caulfield agreed. He didn't, because he recognized you, which Dr. Creed had no way of knowing and no way of predicting. He looked at her steadily. You got lucky, so did he. I didn't get lucky, she said, quiet, not defensive. Rex held his position because I gave him the correct command at the correct moment. That's not luck. I know it's not. But from Creed's perspective, it was. He made a decision that could have ended very differently, and it didn't, and he's currently standing outside taking credit for a crisis response he had nothing to do with. Caulfield stood. He was a compact man, not physically imposing, but he had the kind of stillness in his movement that took up space more effectively than size. I'd like you to make sure the correct version of today is what ends up in the record. He looked at Marfeld when he said it. Marfeld said, I understand. After Caulfield left, the office held its quiet for a moment. Then Marfeld said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly. Lena waited. The 2 applications you put in for the trauma lead position, did you believe Creed was making a fair decision when he passed you over? Lena thought about the correct answer for about 3 seconds. Then she said, No. Why didn't you say something? I did. The second time, I requested a formal review. He told me I was valuable where I was and stopped the conversation. Marfeld was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Lena hadn't expected from the director of a hospital. I'm sorry, I should have seen that. Not an institutional apology. The kind that came with a form. Just the sentence. The weight of it sitting plainly between them. Lena said, Okay. Go get that hand looked at, Marfeld said, and write your incident report before the day gets further away from you. Lena stood. I already started it. Of course you did. She had the cut cleaned and butterfly taped by the 3rd floor supply station before she ran into Creed. He was coming out of the elevator as she was heading back to the trauma floor, and the hallway was narrow enough that there wasn't a natural way to redirect around him. He saw her and slowed, which meant the conversation was already happening whether she wanted it to. Voss. He stopped about 4 feet away. His arms were doing the folded thing, which meant he'd already composed the version of this conversation that put him in the right position. Hell of a morning. Yes, she said. Look, what you did down there, in the bay, that was good instinct, really. A pause. The kind that preceded the part he'd actually planned. But going forward, mass casualty response has a chain of command, and I know you know that. Webb was the senior responder on scene. Webb arrived after I did, she said. He had no triage framework when I reached the scene. I established one. And I appreciate that. But Brandt has said something to me about the handoff. What did she say? Creed paused. The conversation had assumed he'd have more room before that question. She said the handoff was clean, but she also said, if she had a concern, she'll raise it with me directly. Lena looked at him evenly. Was there something else? Creed studied her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. Something had changed in the way she was standing, or in the way she said words, or in something he couldn't locate precisely. And people like Creed, who relied on the gap between what they projected and what others felt comfortable pushing back against, were very sensitive to the feeling of that gap closing. The K9 situation, he said. Caulfield is being, look, military people get particular about protocols. I didn't violate any agreements this morning. I made a staffing decision based on the program's needs. Major Caulfield documented the pre-visit restrictions in writing 3 times. Those were guidelines. They were restrictions, she said. There's a difference. The words landed between them like something set down hard on a counter. Not aggressive, just precise. And Creed's expression did the thing expressions do when a person realizes they've been speaking to someone they thought was smaller than they are. He straightened slightly. I'll keep that in mind going forward. His voice had cooled by about 2 degrees. Get your report in by end of day. Already in progress, she said, and walked past him. She didn't look back. By noon, 3 things had happened that Lena didn't know about yet. The first was that Marfeld had called the hospital's legal counsel and opened a preliminary internal review of the events surrounding the K9 evaluation, flagging specifically the question of whether the placement of a nursing staff member in a restricted military evaluation space constituted a breach of the hospital's duty of care obligations under the VA partnership agreement. The second was that Major Caulfield had spoken to his commanding officer, a full colonel based at Fort Lassen named Soren, and had been authorized to request a formal record inquiry related to Lena's service history, specifically whether any aspect of her prior service record was relevant to the morning's events, and whether disclosure of that record to Harwell's administration was appropriate given the circumstances. The third was that Dr. Marcus Webb, in the break room at 11:47, had told the charge nurse Bev Harland exactly what had happened in the ambulance bay from his perspective, which was the perspective of someone who had arrived to a scene already organized and had spent 40 minutes following the structure someone else had built. Webb was not a man who failed to acknowledge things clearly. He told Bev that Lena had triaged, directed, and managed the casualty response from first contact, and that without her presence and framework, the outcomes would have been different. Bev was not the kind of person who kept things like that to herself. By 2 o'clock, the trauma floor had a version of the morning's events that was close enough to accurate to be useful, and it had spread to the surgical floor, the administrative support staff, and at least 2 people in hospital communications. Lena was in room 214 checking a post-op veteran's vitals when Bev appeared in the doorway and gave her a look that communicated several things without words. Lena finished the vitals, made her notes, and stepped into the corridor. Creed filed a complaint, Bev said, with Marfeld's office. Lena waited. He's saying you exceeded your scope of practice during the emergency response, that you gave directives outside your authority, and that the handoff to Brandt contained, Bev paused, visibly annoyed at the words she was about to say, irregularities. Brandt told him the handoff was clean. He didn't file the complaint with Brandt, he filed it with Marfeld. Bev lowered her voice. And he included in the complaint a reference to your K9 evaluation involvement. He's saying you put yourself in a restricted space without proper authorization. The precision of that reframing took Lena a moment to fully process. Creed had placed her in the restricted space, and now the complaint said she had placed herself there. The inversion was neat and would require anyone who hadn't been present to spend significant time with documentation before they could confirm which version was true. Has Marfeld responded? Lena asked. Not yet. But Lena. Bev looked at her with the directness of someone who had worked alongside a person long enough to be honest with them. He also flagged your service record, the gap. He's saying there are questions about your qualifications that weren't properly vetted during your hiring. The cut on Lena's palm throbbed once under the butterfly tape. He's trying to get ahead of the Caulfield report, she said. That's what it looks like. Lena exhaled slowly. Not panic. The particular focused stillness that arrived when a situation clarified. Okay. Okay? Bev stared at her. Voss, he's trying to make your record the story instead of his. I know. That means the record is going to matter. She checked her watch. I need to finish my incident report. It's already submitted. I know. I need to add a supplemental. Bev watched her head back toward the nursing station with the expression of someone trying to determine whether the person in front of them was calm because they didn't understand the problem or because they'd already thought several steps past it. The supplemental report took Lena 40 minutes. She was methodical about it, not defensive, not emotional, just sequential. Every action she had taken during the emergency response, logged with timestamps, clinical reasoning, and the relevant standard of care reference for each decision. She included the command she had used with Rex, the indication he had given for the secondary casualty, and the location confirmation from Major Caulfield. She included Webb's presence and the specific directives she had given him and why. She included the handoff to Brandt, word for word. Then she went back to the beginning and added a section documenting her assignment to the K9 evaluation space, the time of the verbal instruction from Creed, the name of the charge nurse who had delivered it, and the fact that she had been given no documentation, no clearance, and no information about the dog's individual behavioral profiles before being placed in the room. She saved it and sent it to Marfeld's office and the hospital's nursing oversight coordinator simultaneously. Then she went back to the floor. The afternoon passed in the way that afternoons pass in hospital trauma units. Not smoothly, because nothing in a trauma unit is smooth, but with the rhythm of problems that could be solved if you moved fast enough and paid close enough attention. A veteran in room 208 with a wound infection that needed an escalated antibiotic protocol. A family member in the third-floor waiting area who was asking questions that weren't getting answered, which Lena addressed by sitting down with them for 7 minutes and actually answering the questions. A medication order that had been transcribed incorrectly. She caught it on review before it reached the patient. She didn't think about Creed's complaint, or rather, she thought about it the way you think about weather when you're inside. It was there. It was happening. There was nothing to do about it right now except ensure that every action she took for the rest of the day was exactly as documented and correct as everything she'd done before it. At 4:15, she passed the second-floor rehab room on her way to the supply station. The door was open. The dogs were still there. They hadn't been moved to the ground floor yet, apparently. She could see the edge of Delta's kennel from the corridor. She slowed without meaning to. Rex was visible near the far wall. He'd been lying down, but his head came up as she passed the door. He tracked her without moving his body, the way dogs track things that matter to them. She kept walking. At 4:43, her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. Military exchange format, Fort Lassen area code. Ms. Voss. Colonel Soren approved the record inquiry. You'll receive formal communication within 48 hours. You should know, the process will require your statement. Caulfield. She read it twice. Then she put the phone in her pocket and went back to work. At 5:20, Bev found her again. Lena had been standing at the nursing station writing an end-of-shift summary, and Bev's expression when she appeared was different from the one she'd been wearing all day. Less urgency. Something harder to read. Creed's complaint, Bev said. Marfeld rejected it. Lena looked up. Not tabled. Rejected. Returned with a notation. Bev kept her voice low. Marfeld cited insufficient grounds and flagged it as potentially retaliatory given the open internal review. Lena set down her pen. He also... Bev stopped. Seemed to decide something. He went to the board liaison. Escalated over Marfeld's head. He's claiming the internal review is improperly motivated, and that there are questions about Marfeld's impartiality given her meeting with Caulfield this morning. The precision of that move sat in the air between them. He's not going to stop, Bev said. He's not the kind of man who... I know what kind of man he is, Lena said. She picked up her pen. What are you going to do? Bev asked. Lena finished the last line of her summary, signed it, and placed it in the outgoing documentation tray. I'm going to go home, she said, and tomorrow morning I'm going to come back and do my job. She looked at Bev. That's all I've ever done. Bev stared at her, then said quietly, Sometimes I forget how well you handle being underestimated. Lena almost said something to that, then didn't. She clocked out at 5:41. The parking structure at Harwell was 3 levels, attached to the north side of the building. Lena's car was on the 2nd level. She took the stairs. She was on the landing between the 1st and 2nd floors when she heard the footsteps behind her. 2 sets, coming down from above rather than up from below, which meant someone had been on level 2 and was following her down. She didn't stop walking. She listened to the pace. Not aggressive. Measured. Intentional. She came through the stairwell door onto level 2 and turned. 2 men she didn't recognize. One in his late 30s, the other maybe 50, both in civilian clothes. Good civilian clothes. The kind that fit correctly and didn't look like they'd been chosen for comfort. The older one had a badge on a lanyard that he hadn't tucked under his jacket, which meant he wanted her to see it. Department of Defense. Office of Inspector General. Ms. Voss, the older one said, My name is Whitfield. This is Agent Dara. We've been asked to conduct a preliminary inquiry on behalf of a request from Fort Lassen. We'd like to speak with you. Lena looked at the badge, then at both of them. Today? She said. If possible. She thought about the cut on her palm and the 5 hours of the day that were now behind her and the 40-minute drive between her apartment and this parking structure. How long? She said. An hour, maybe less. She looked at Whitfield steadily, then at the badge again. DoD Inspector General didn't show up in hospital parking lots for preliminary inquiries about K9 evaluations. That was not what this was about. What specifically is the inquiry about? She said. Whitfield and Dara exchanged a look that lasted less than a second, the kind of exchange between people who had agreed on how much to say before this conversation began. It concerns a formal complaint, Whitfield said. filed this afternoon against Dr. Phillip Creed. He paused. And a secondary matter that's been flagged as potentially relevant to an active investigation. Lena went very still. What investigation? She said. Whitfield said, that's what we'd like to discuss. The parking structure was quiet around them. The particular quiet of a place that was mostly concrete and not much else. Somewhere below, a car engine turned over and faded toward the exit ramp. Lena looked at the two agents in their well-fitted civilian clothes, in the low fluorescent light of Level 2, and understood with a clarity that arrived all at once rather than gradually, that this day, which had started with burnt coffee and a dog evaluation and a man who thought she was furniture, had not reached its actual center yet. She said, "Where?" Whitfield's car was a gray government sedan parked on Level 1, the kind of vehicle that announced itself as a government sedan without trying to, just by virtue of being completely without personality. Dara drove. Whitfield sat in the passenger seat and turned slightly toward Lena in the back, which was the configuration of someone who had done a lot of preliminary interviews and understood that the person in the rear seat needed to feel like they were talking to someone, not being transported. They went to a hotel conference room 6 blocks from the hospital. Neutral ground. Not a federal building, not Harwell, not anywhere that would put Lena on the defensive before the conversation started. That was intentional. She recognized the geometry of it, the way she recognized most things, by what it was trying to accomplish. The conference room had a table, 4 chairs, a pitcher of water that nobody touched, and a recording device that Whitfield placed on the table and identified before he started asking anything. "We're not here to investigate you," Whitfield said. "I want to be direct about that from the start." "Then what are you here to investigate?" Lena said. Dara opened a folder. He was a quieter presence than Whitfield, the kind of person who collected information by not filling silence. He set 3 pages on the table and slid them toward her. The top page was a procurement contract, Harwell Veterans Medical Center, dated 14 months ago. The contracting party was a company called Meridian Tactical Solutions, a defense subcontractor that provided medical supply logistics and specialized equipment to VA-affiliated facilities. The contract value was listed at $4.3 million over a 24-month period. The second page was an amendment to the same contract, dated 9 months ago, increasing the scope to include specialized trauma equipment for the hospital's proposed Veteran Emergency Response Program. The amendment pushed the total value to $6.8 million. The third page was a signed authorization for the amendment. The signature was Phillip Creed's. Lena looked at the pages without touching them. Then she looked at Whitfield. "He doesn't have authorization to sign procurement contracts at that value level," she said. "That requires the hospital director's signature above a certain threshold." "Above $2 million, Whitfield confirmed. "Yes, so either Marfeld co-signed something that isn't shown here. Director Marfeld has no record of authorizing or reviewing either the original contract or the amendment." Dara said it flat, factual. She was not informed of the amendment. As far as we can determine, she was not aware the amendment existed until this afternoon. The room absorbed that for a moment. "Meridian Tactical Solutions," Lena said. "What's their relationship to Creed?" Whitfield looked at her with the slight recalibration of someone who had expected that question to come later. "That's part of what we're establishing. What we can tell you is that the original contract was routed through an administrative process that bypassed the standard vendor review committee. The waiver that allowed that bypass was signed by Creed in his capacity as ER director, a role that does not include procurement authorization, but the waiver itself was processed by a coordinator who no longer works at Harwell." He paused. "The coordinator left 11 months ago. Voluntarily, on record. We're looking at whether the departure was actually voluntary." Lena sat back slightly. Not in surprise, in the posture of someone integrating information and making room for the next piece. "Why am I here?" she said. "Specifically." Whitfield took a breath. 3 months ago, a supply discrepancy was flagged during a routine VA audit of Harwell's trauma unit inventory. The equipment listed in the Meridian contract, certain categories of specialized trauma gear, was recorded as delivered and in service. But the audit found that approximately 40% of the listed items either didn't exist in the inventory or had been substituted with lower-grade alternatives that were billed at the contracted price. He paused. The discrepancy was flagged by someone in the nursing staff. The flag went to the supply chain coordinator, who routed it to Creed's office. The notation in the file says the concern was reviewed and resolved, but there's no documentation of how it was resolved. Who flagged it? Lena said. Dara looked at her steadily. You did? She was quiet for a moment. 3 months ago, she said. The crash cart restock. Walk us through that. She thought back to it. A Tuesday morning, a different kind of quiet than today. She'd been restocking a crash cart after a night shift depletion and had cross-referenced the unit inventory against the VA equipment specification she kept in her phone as a reference document. The defibrillator pads were correct. The airway management kit was correct. The hemorrhage control package was not in a dramatic way, not in a way that would have caught anyone's eye who wasn't specifically looking for the specification grade. The tourniquet in the kit was a commercial-grade item, correct brand, but a lower tensile specification than what the Meridian contract had listed as delivered. She had documented it. Standard supply discrepancy form, flagged it to the coordinator. Nothing had happened. She had assumed the coordinator had processed it through Creed's office and determined it was within acceptable variation range. She had not followed up. She had about 800 other things to track in any given week, and she was not, at that point in time, in a position where pushing back on a supply chain decision through Creed's office had felt like a viable path. She said all of this to Whitfield, plainly, with dates where she could recall them and approximations where she couldn't. Dara was writing, not on a laptop, in a notebook, which was either old habit or the kind of deliberate analog choice people made when they didn't want records to be easily subpoenaed. Probably both. The item you flagged, Whitfield said. Do you remember the lot number? No, but I kept a copy of the form. Both men looked at her. Paper copy, she said, in a file at home. I keep duplicates of any supply discrepancy flag I submit, because twice in my first year here, the electronic copies didn't appear in the system after I submitted them. I asked about it and was told it was a software issue. She paused. It happened 3 times after that. Dara stopped writing and looked at Whitfield. Whitfield said, Ms. Voss, how many supply discrepancy forms have you submitted in total during your time at Harwell? She thought about it. 11? Maybe 12? Over 3 years? How many of those are in the hospital's electronic documentation system? She hadn't checked. She'd never had a reason to check because she'd submitted them and moved on. I don't know, she said. 4, Dara said. We pulled the records this afternoon. The implications of that number arranged themselves in the air between them without anyone needing to say them out loud. 11 or 12 forms. 4 in the system. The ones that had disappeared were not random. They were the ones that had landed near the Meridian contract's scope of supply, the ones that would have created a paper trail pointing toward the same discrepancy an audit had eventually flagged anyway, too late and too thin to result in immediate action. Someone had been cleaning records, and the cleaning had been deliberate enough to be invisible until someone came looking. We'll need copies of everything you have at home, Whitfield said. Whatever you're comfortable providing voluntarily, we're not issuing anything tonight. I'll bring them tomorrow, Lena said, to Harwell's administrative office. I'm not handing documents to anyone in a hotel parking lot. Whitfield almost smiled. Fair enough. She looked at the 3 pages still on the table. You came to the hospital parking lot instead of contacting me through official channels. We wanted to speak with you before the hospital's legal team did, Whitfield said. Once Marfeld's office is formally notified of the inquiry scope, Harwell's counsel will advise all staff to route communications through them. That's normal, that's correct, but it makes preliminary conversations difficult. You knew about the complaint Creed filed today. We were notified, yes. And you're here tonight because the complaint Creed filed today, against you, is the 4th time in 14 months that a Harwell staff member who had contact with Meridian-related supply documentation has faced a formal complaint or disciplinary action, Whitfield said. Of the previous 3, 2 resigned and 1 was terminated. All 3 had submitted discrepancy reports shortly before their complaints were filed. The water pitcher sat between them, untouched and sweating slightly in the room's air conditioning. Lena said, He knew I submitted the flag 3 months ago. We believe he knew within 24 hours. And he kept me on staff. Keeping you on staff with a diminished scope and no pathway to advancement is less visible than terminating you, Dara said. It was the most he'd said in one sentence since they'd started. A nurse who leaves is gone. A nurse who stays and goes quiet is managed. Lena looked at the table for a moment, not in devastation, in the particular reckoning of someone who has been told the shape of something they had sensed without being able to name. She had known something was wrong. She had documented it correctly, and then set it down because the alternative, pushing it alone through a system that Creed controlled, had seemed like the kind of hill that would cost her more than she was willing to spend at the time. She had been managed. The words sat in her chest with a weight that had nothing to do with self-pity and everything to do with the specific exhaustion of being right about something and having nowhere to take it. "What happens now?" she said. "The inquiry expands," Whitfield said. "The Fort Lassen request, the record inquiry on your service history, gives us a secondary authorization pathway that operates outside Harwell's internal review process. Major Caulfield's report about today's events, combined with the procurement irregularities, creates grounds for a joint investigation." He looked at her steadily. "You're not a target. You're a material witness with potential documentary evidence. The distinction matters." "And Creed?" Whitfield picked up the 3 pages and squared them back into the folder. "Dr. Creed filed a complaint against you this afternoon and escalated to the board liaison 2 hours later. That escalation will be reviewed by people who are now aware of the broader inquiry." He closed the folder. Complaints have a way of looking different in context. She drove home in the dark with the window down, despite the cold, because she needed the air to be moving. The apartment was the same as she'd left it that morning. Small, functional, not quite personalized enough to look like anyone actually lived there. 3 years in Colorado, and she still hadn't put anything on the walls. She kept meaning to. She kept finding other things to do instead. She sat at the kitchen table and called no one. She didn't have a lot of people to call, which was not something she thought about often, and was thinking about now only because the day had been long enough that the usual structure she maintained around that fact had gotten worn down at the edges. She had colleagues. She had Bev, who was the closest thing to a friend the job had produced. She had a sister in Oregon who she called on birthdays and holidays, and during gaps of silence that stretched long enough to feel like neglect. She did not have anyone she called when she was sitting at a kitchen table processing the information that the past 3 years of her professional life had been deliberately shaped by a man who had identified her as a threat to something he was doing and had kept her small as a management strategy. She made tea instead, sat with it, let it cool without drinking it. The file was in the bottom drawer of her bedroom dresser. A manila envelope, not labeled, thick enough that she'd had to fold it twice to get it in the drawer. Inside, photocopies of every supply discrepancy form she'd submitted in 3 years at Harwell, along with her own handwritten notes on each one. Dates, lot numbers, specific observations, the reference specifications she'd used to identify the variances. She pulled the envelope out and sat on the edge of the bed and went through it page by page. 11 forms. She'd counted right. Of the 7 that weren't in the hospital's electronic system, 4 had lot numbers that fell within the delivery window of the Meridian contract's first phase. The tourniquet specification she'd flagged 3 months ago was the most recent. The earliest was from 19 months ago, a variance in a wound irrigation kit, small enough to miss if you weren't specifically looking for the specification grade, large enough to matter in a hemorrhage management scenario. 19 months. She'd been documenting this for 19 months without knowing she was documenting anything except ordinary supply chain slippage. She put the forms back in the envelope and set it on the bedside table and tried to sleep. She managed about 4 hours. At 6:15 the next morning, Lena was back at Harwell. Not because she was scheduled until 7, she wasn't, but because she'd been awake since 5 and had determined that sitting in her apartment was less useful than being somewhere she could move. She changed into scrubs, clocked in at 6:58, and went straight to the supply room to finish the crash cart restock she'd started the morning before, which had been interrupted by the K9 evaluation assignment that had then been interrupted by a structural collapse and a government inquiry and a parking lot conversation that had recontextualized 3 years of her life. She worked through the cart systematically, every item cross-referenced against spec, every variance documented on a fresh form, which she photographed on her phone before submitting electronically and retained a handwritten duplicate. Bev arrived at 7:10 and found her still in the supply room. "You look like you slept about as well as I did," Bev said. "I slept fine." Bev looked at the stack of fresh documentation forms on the counter. "What's all that?" Updated crash cart inventory. Bev was quiet for a moment. Lena. I'm doing my job, Bev. I know you are. Bev closed the door behind her. Creed's escalation to the board. They're meeting this morning, 7:30. Marfeld's been in her office since before I got here. She paused. Webb's been asked to provide a written account of yesterday's emergency response. Brandt, too. Good. Creed is also... Someone told me he called a lawyer last night. Lena filed the last form and capped her pen. He should. Bev stared at her. How are you not more scared right now? I've been in scarier rooms, Lena said simply, and I had better documentation in worse ones. She picked up her badge and went to the floor. The board meeting lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. Lena knew this because she tracked the time the way she tracked all things that were happening in adjacent spaces during a shift, not obsessively, just as background awareness. At 9:44, she saw Marfeld walk through the trauma floor corridor in the direction of the elevator with the posture of someone who had just spent 2 hours defending something and was not entirely sure they'd won. Creed was not with her. At 10:17, a hospital administrator Lena didn't recognize appeared on the trauma floor and asked to speak with Dr. Webb. Webb looked at Lena once across the nursing station, a look that asked nothing and confirmed something, and followed the administrator to the elevator. At 11:02, Caulfield arrived. Not in the casual civilian clothes he'd been wearing the day before. In uniform. Full dress. Which was the kind of thing you wore when you were making a point with your presence rather than your words. He came through the main entrance with a second military officer Lena didn't recognize and went directly to the administrative floor without stopping at the nursing station. She watched them cross the lobby through the window at the end of the trauma corridor. Delta, Sable, and Rex were not with him. The dogs were still in the ground floor holding space. Then her radio crackled. Voss, room 208, patient down. She moved. The veteran in 208 was a 63-year-old named Harlan Briggs, retired Army, bilateral hip replacement, admitted for a post-surgical wound infection that had been responding to the adjusted antibiotic protocol she'd ordered, reviewed the previous afternoon. I was on the floor beside his bed when she arrived, conscious but confused, his IV line pulled partially from the access port on his left arm and bleeding steadily from the site. She got him off the floor first, not cleanly. He was 190 pounds, and one of his hips was compromised, and she had about 30 seconds before a nursing assistant arrived to help. And she took most of his weight on her right side and got him to the bed without him hitting anything on the way up, though her lower back registered a complaint that she filed away for later. He was pale. His skin was clammy. His BP on the bedside monitor was lower than it should be for someone sitting upright. Mr. Briggs, talk to me. What happened? Got dizzy. His voice was slurred in the specific way of someone whose blood pressure had dropped too fast. Tried to get up. Everything went sideways. She was already assessing the arm. The IV site was bleeding, but not arterially, controllable with pressure. She applied it and held while she used her free hand to check his pedal pulse. Present, adequate. She looked at his ankle, swollen since yesterday, which she'd noted, which she'd flagged in the chart as requiring reevaluation this morning, which apparently hadn't happened yet. The wound site on his right hip was warm through the dressing, warmer than it had been at yesterday's check. When did you last have your antibiotics? She said. They brought something around midnight, the night nurse. And this morning? He blinked. I don't think... Nobody came this morning. She checked the chart on the bedside tablet. The morning antibiotic dose, due at 7, was listed as administered at 7:04. Except she knew the nurse on overnight rotation. She knew the handover sheet. The overnight nurse had gone off at 7, and the incoming morning nurse, Petrov, a solid, if sometimes scattered clinician, had been pulled to cover a situation on the 4th floor between 6:45 and 7:30. The administration entry was either a documentation error or it was falsified. She looked at Briggs's wound site again. The warmth had a particular quality to it, not the diffuse heat of normal surgical inflammation, but the concentrated, pulsing heat of infection that had been losing ground to antibiotics for 48 hours and had just been handed back the advantage. I'm going to need a blood draw, and I'm going to call Dr. Brandt, she said. Your infection may have progressed. We're going to get ahead of it. Is it bad? She looked at him directly, not reassuringly, honestly. It's manageable if we move now. He nodded. He was the kind of veteran who preferred honesty to comfort. She'd noticed that on day one. She was at the door calling for the nursing assistant when she nearly walked into Creed. He was in the corridor outside 208, not scrubbed in, not positioned for standing there with his arms slightly away from his sides, in the posture of someone who had something to say and was deciding how to position it. "Voss," he said. In a moment. She relayed the blood draw request and the Brandt notification to the nursing assistant, watched him start moving, and then turned to Creed. "My office," Creed said. "I have a patient deteriorating in 208. I'm aware. This won't take long. Dr. Creed," she kept her voice level. "I have a patient who may have missed his morning antibiotic dose due to a documentation irregularity and is showing signs of wound infection progression. That is my priority right now. If you need to speak with me, I am available when he is stable." Something crossed Creed's face. The expression of a man who was used to using the authority of a summons to establish ground position and had just been told, cleanly and without aggression, that the ground position wasn't available. "This is about your conduct yesterday and today," he said. "There are questions about whether your involvement in the emergency response and your subsequent communications with Marfeld's office constitute—" "I'm going to stop you there," she said, "because anything related to my conduct should be routed through the formal review process, which I believe is already open. If you have questions for me through that process, I will answer them. But I'm not having a hallway conversation about my conduct with you directly while my patient needs attention." She paused. "That's not me being difficult. That's me following the protocol you are also supposed to be following." Creed's jaw tightened. The nursing assistant came back with the blood draw kit. Lena turned and went into room 208 and closed the door. She spent the next 25 minutes with Briggs, drew the cultures herself, documented everything, called Brandt directly, rather than routing through the floor coordinator. Brandt arrived at 11:43 and agreed with Lena's assessment within 4 minutes of examining the wound site. "Escalate the protocol," Brandt said. "I want imaging on the hip joint, rule out deep tissue involvement, and find out what happened with the morning dose." "Already flagged," Lena said. Brandt looked at her, looked at the documentation on the tablet, looked at the timestamp on Lena's flag. "You charted this before I got here." "I chart as I go." Brandt handed the tablet back without a word, but she had the expression she'd had at the ambulance bay handoff, the one that said she was revising a file she kept internally on people. At 12:15, while Lena was updating Briggs's chart at the nursing station, Bev appeared at her elbow again. Bev had acquired the habit, over the course of this particular day, of appearing at Lena's elbow with information the way weather systems arrived. Not entirely predictable, but not surprising either. "Creed's been called to the boardroom," Bev said quietly. "He's been up there for 40 minutes. Lena kept typing. "Caulfield's still in the building. The second officer with him. Someone told me he's from the DOD Legal Liaison Office." Bev paused. "Lena, whatever is happening upstairs is not a routine meeting." "I know." "Are you going to tell me what you know?" Lena thought about the hotel conference room, the 3 pages on the table. The water pitcher nobody had touched. "Not yet," she said. "When I can, I will." Bev accepted that with the grace of someone who had decided, at some point in the past 24 hours, to stop trying to predict what Lena Voss was going to do and simply wait to see it. At 1:47 in the afternoon, the trauma floor received a notice from hospital administration. It was brief. It said that Dr. Phillip Creed was temporarily relieved of his duties as Emergency Department Director, effective immediately, pending the outcome of an internal review and a concurrent external inquiry. All department functions were to be managed by the attending senior physician on shift until further notice. The notice went to every departmental inbox simultaneously. Lena read it at the nursing station. Then she went back to her chart updates. 2 minutes later, her phone buzzed. Whitfield. "Documents whenever you're ready. We'll be at the administrative office until 1800. She finished the chart, went to her locker, took out the manila envelope she'd brought in that morning in her bag because she had known, not hoped, known, that today was the day it would be needed. She was heading toward the elevator when she heard the sound from the far end of the ground floor corridor. She stopped. The K9 holding room was at the end of that corridor. The sound was Rex. She recognized his register, had always been able to distinguish between the 3 of them. Not agitated, not alarmed, attentive. She didn't go to the room. She kept walking toward the elevator. But as she passed the corridor junction, she glanced left. The holding room door was ajar. Through the gap, she could see Rex sitting at the threshold, watching the hallway. When he saw her, his ears came forward and his tail moved once. He'd been waiting. She almost stopped, then pressed the elevator button and fixed her eyes on the closed doors. The envelope in her hands was 11 discrepancy forms and 19 months of careful documentation that had looked every single day like nothing more than a quiet nurse doing her job exactly right. She pressed 4. The elevator rose, and on the 3rd floor, through the brief moment when the doors slid open and the corridor was briefly visible before the car continued upward, she saw Creed. He was standing in the hallway outside the boardroom, alone, not moving, his arms loose at his sides in the specific posture of a man who has just been told something he cannot argue his way out of. His face was angled toward the floor. He didn't see her. The doors closed. She rode the last floor in silence. When they opened on 4, Whitfield was already in the corridor, not waiting for her specifically, or perhaps exactly waiting for her specifically. She couldn't tell. And Dara was beside him, and there was a third person she hadn't seen before, a woman in her mid-40s in a suit jacket, no lanyard, no badge visible, with the particular composure of someone who had been doing this job long enough that urgency expressed itself in stillness rather than movement. The woman looked at the envelope in Lena's hand. "Ms. Voss," she said, "I'm Deputy Inspector Hale. I need you to come with us." Not the conference room this time. Whitfield was already holding a door open. Not the administrative office, the small conference room adjacent to it. Through the door, Lena could see a laptop and a speakerphone and 2 more people she didn't recognize, both of them in the posture of people waiting for a meeting that was already late starting. "What happened?" Lena said. Hale looked at her with the particular directness of someone who had made a decision about this person and was acting on it. "A second witness came forward an hour ago," Hale said. "Someone internal. They've given us documentation that connects the Meridian irregularities to a broader procurement fraud scheme across 3 VA-affiliated facilities." She paused. "Harwell is the largest, and the documentation they provided references your supply discrepancy flags by name." Lena went very still. "Someone used your flags," Hale said. "They pulled the originals, not the versions Creed's office had access to, the originals you submitted, and cross-referenced them against Meridian's billing records. That cross-reference is what broke the case open." She looked at Lena steadily. "The witness wants to speak with you directly before they give a formal statement. They say you're the reason they decided to come forward." Lena looked at the open door, at the laptop and the speakerphone and the people she didn't know. "Who is it?" she said. Hale hesitated. 1 second, which was the first hesitation Lena had seen from her. "The administrative coordinator," Hale said. "The one who left Harwell 11 months ago. The one we thought left voluntarily." Lena looked at Hale for a long moment. She said, "She didn't leave voluntarily." "No," Hale said. "She didn't." The conference room waited. The speakerphone sat on the table with its green ready light glowing in the afternoon quiet, connected to somewhere Lena couldn't see, where a woman who had been pushed out of a job and had apparently spent 11 months deciding whether the cost of coming forward was one she could pay, had finally made her choice. Lena stepped through the door. And somewhere below, in a holding room at the end of a ground floor corridor, Rex lifted his head from his paws, turned toward the ceiling, and was still. The woman on the speakerphone was named Adria Solis. Lena knew the name. She'd seen it on routing stamps at the bottom of supply chain forms during her first year at Harwell, before the name had disappeared from the paperwork and been replaced by a generic departmental signature. She had not known Adria Solis personally. They had worked in the same building for 2 years without ever being in the same room. Adria's voice through the speakerphone was steady in the specific way of someone who had rehearsed steadiness. The slight delay before each answer wasn't hesitation, it was precision. She was choosing every word with the care of someone who had spent 11 months deciding whether to say anything at all and had finally decided and was not going to waste it. "I need you to understand something first," Adria said. "Before we go any further, I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because Dr. Creed made it clear that if I didn't, documentation he had access to about a personal matter, a legal matter, nothing criminal, a debt dispute from 3 years before I worked at Harwell, would find its way to the hospital board. He didn't say it directly. He had someone else say it. But the message was clear. Hale said, "We have that on record. You don't need to reestablish it." "I'm establishing it for her." A pause. "Ms. Voss, the reason I'm talking right now is because of the forms you filed, the ones that didn't make it into the system." Lena said, "How did you get copies?" "Because I made them, before I left." Adria's voice carried something through it. Not pride exactly, but the particular feeling of someone who had made one good decision on the way out the door and had been holding it for 11 months, waiting for it to matter. "When I realized what was happening with the Meridian paperwork, what Creed was doing with the routing, the amendments, I started copying everything that crossed my desk, including the discrepancy forms that came through the supply chain office. I kept them because I thought someday they'd matter." "Why didn't you come forward before now?" Lena asked. A longer pause. "Because I was scared," Adria said. "And because I didn't think anyone would believe me over him. And because—" She stopped. "Because I watched what happened to the two people before me who tried. One ended up with a performance review that made her unemployable in healthcare administration for 2 years. The other, I don't know exactly what happened to him, but he left Colorado entirely." A breath. "I needed to know someone was actually looking, that it wasn't just me handing documents to people and then watching nothing happen again." Hale said, "The OIG inquiry gave you that assurance." "The OIG inquiry, plus the fact that Major Caulfield's report mentioned Voss by name." Adria's voice shifted slightly. "I remembered the name from the forms. She filed 11 of them over 3 years. 11. And she kept coming back. Even when nothing happened, she just kept documenting." Another pause, softer. "I needed to know someone like that was in the room before I said anything." Lena looked at the table, at the speakerphone, at her own hands, the butterfly tape on her left palm slightly loose at one edge. She said, "Tell us about the Meridian Amendment, the one that went to 6.8 million. And Adria talked. She talked for 47 minutes. Hale's team recorded every word. Dara filled 8 pages of his notebook, and Whitfield managed the call with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly which questions to ask and when to stay silent. Lena asked 4 questions total, all of them aimed at the mechanics of how the paperwork had moved, which desks, which signatures, which routing paths, because she understood documentation in ways that made her useful in a way that emotional responses to Adria's account would not. The picture that emerged was not complicated. Complicated schemes were harder to sustain. This one was clean, which was exactly the problem. Meridian Tactical Solutions had a relationship with Creed that predated his time at Harwell. A prior facility, a prior contract, an arrangement that had worked well enough that when Creed moved to Harwell 11 years ago, the relationship had gone dormant and waited for the right contract size to be worth reactivating. The VA partnership expansion had provided that. The mechanism. Meridian delivered equipment at the contracted specification and billed at the contracted rate. 6 to 12 months later, a second delivery quietly replaced a portion of the inventory with lower-grade alternatives, same brand, different specification tier, cheaper to produce, invisible to anyone not actively cross-referencing against the original specification documents. The billing stayed the same. The difference between the contracted cost and the actual production cost moved through 2 shell entities before reaching its destination. 3 VA-affiliated facilities, 14 months of active operation. Total estimated discrepancy across all 3 sites was somewhere north of $2 million, with Harwell representing the largest single component. Creed hadn't built the scheme. Meridian had offered the arrangement, and he had accepted it and managed the local operation, keeping the paperwork clean, managing the staff who got too close to the edges, using his position as ER director to control the one department where discrepancies were most likely to surface, because trauma nursing used the equipment constantly and used it in high-stakes conditions where specification grade was not an abstract concern. He had known about Lena's first flag within 24 hours because Adria, still employed at that point, had routed it to him per standard protocol. He had known about the second because a floor coordinator had mentioned it in a meeting he attended. He had known about every flag she submitted because he had been watching for them specifically. And he had kept her on staff, underpromoted, underutilized, unable to escalate meaningfully, because terminating a nurse who kept filing discrepancy reports would have created the exact documentary trail he needed to avoid. Better to keep her in place, ensure her reports went nowhere, and maintain her at a level of professional frustration that was manageable but not acute. Frustrated enough to be distracted, not frustrated enough to go external. It was an efficient system. It had almost worked. When Adria's call ended, the conference room held a specific quality of quiet. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something completed. Hale looked at Lena across the table. "Your documentation," she said. Lena slid the manila envelope across. Hale opened it, looked at the first page, passed it to Dara, without looking up. She went through the first 3 forms quickly, then slowed. Stopped at Form 7, the wound irrigation kit from 19 months ago, and held it toward the light the way people hold documents when they want to be certain of what they're looking at. "Hand copy," Hale said, "written out the same day I submitted the electronic version, date in the upper right corner. Matches a gap in the electronic system." "Yes." Hale set it down carefully, the way things get set down when they've just become evidence rather than paperwork. "How long have you been keeping these?" "Since the second time an electronic submission didn't appear in the system, approximately 2 years. Whitfield made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. 2 years of physical copies. "I work in a hospital," Lena said. "Documentation errors have consequences. I got in the habit." Hale looked at her with the expression Lena was becoming familiar with, the one that placed her in a different category than where she'd started the conversation. "We're going to need a formal statement. Full account of every flag, every submission, every instance where a form failed to appear in the system. Dates, clinical reasoning, the reference specifications you used to identify each variance." She paused. "Not today, within the week." "I'll make myself available," Lena said. She stood. "Ms. Voss," Hale said it before she reached the door. "The board meeting this morning, the outcome of that meeting, combined with what Adria Solis just provided, gives us grounds to escalate from a preliminary inquiry to a formal joint investigation. Creed's administrative access will be suspended formally. The board will be notified of the full scope." She paused. "Things are going to move quickly." "Okay," Lena said. "That may be difficult for you, given your position in the department." Lena thought about room 208, about Harlan Briggs and his wound site and his missed morning antibiotic. "I have patience," she said. "I'll manage." She went back to the floor. The afternoon ran differently than the morning, not calmer, but more directional. Lena worked her shift with the focus that arrived when she stopped allocating energy toward things she couldn't act on immediately. Briggs's imaging came back at 2:40. No deep tissue involvement, infection hadn't reached the joint. The escalated protocol was the right call and had been made in time. She updated his chart, documented her reasoning, and sat with him for 4 minutes while he processed the information. "You're going to be fine," she said. "We caught it." "Barely," he said. He was the kind of man who needed honest margins. "Barely still counts," she said. He almost smiled. "Army medics used to say that." She didn't respond to that. She checked his IV line and left. At 3:15, Bev appeared at the nursing station wearing the expression of someone who had been sitting on information and had finally lost the ability to hold it. "Creed's office," she said. "Administrative lockout. I was up there 40 minutes ago. His keycard access has been suspended above the 2nd floor." Lena kept writing in the chart. "The whole department is talking," Bev said. "People who've worked under him for 8 years are—" "Lena, this is significant. This is a real—" "The patients still need their 4 o'clock vitals," Lena said. Bev stared at her. "How are you this calm?" "I'm not calm. I'm busy." She looked up. "Same thing right now." Bev left. Came back 11 minutes later with fresh information the way she had been doing all day, like weather arriving. "Creed is in the lobby," she said. "He came in through the main entrance and he's just standing there. Security is watching him, but nobody's removed him." Lena set down her pen. This was the part she hadn't fully thought through. Not the mechanics of what was happening upstairs, which she'd had time to process, but the human remainder of it. The man standing in a lobby that had been his for 11 years. Unable to access most of the building that surrounded it, not yet able to leave. She understood what that specific moment was. She had been in the equivalent of it herself, in different circumstances, in a different country, at the end of something she'd had to walk away from and hadn't entirely wanted to. The specific experience of standing somewhere that used to be yours and realizing the past tense of it, that she understood. She did not feel sorry for him, but she understood the moment, and understanding it was not the same as sympathy. She did not go to the lobby. She went to her patients. At 4:07, Caulfield appeared on the trauma floor in full dress uniform. He came to the nursing station and asked for her by name. They walked to the end of the corridor, to the window that overlooked the ambulance bay. Temporary structural supports in place, surface pressure washed. The only visible evidence of the previous day's collapse, a slightly lighter rectangle of concrete where the cleaning equipment had worked longest. Colonel Soren approved the declassification request this morning, Caulfield said. Your service record, the restricted portion. Lena looked at the bay. That was fast, she said. He expedited it. The restricted operational details stay classified. That doesn't change. But your specialty training, your operational history, your attachment to the Fort Lassen unit, those will be made available to Harwell's administration and to the OIG inquiry. I didn't ask for that, she said. I know. My service record has nothing to do with the procurement fraud. No, he agreed. But it has something to do with the pattern of how you were managed in this department, and the OIG inquiry covers institutional conduct broadly. He paused. Hale requested it. I supported the request. Lena was quiet for a moment. A hospital van moved through the bay below, slowed, continued toward the main entrance. People are going to want to make it into something, she said. The dogs, the service record, the emergency response. They'll want the version where the secret hero gets revealed. Probably, Caulfield said. That's not what happened. I know what happened. He looked at her directly. 3 dogs remembered someone who treated them correctly. 1 nurse documented supply discrepancies for 2 years because she believed accuracy mattered, even when no one was paying attention. He paused. The story people tell about it will be imprecise. That's unavoidable. I don't want recognition, she said. I want the supply chain fixed. I want the equipment in those trauma carts to be what it's supposed to be, because the people using those carts came here because they trusted this institution. Caulfield was quiet for a moment. That's why I supported the request, he said. He left at 4:22. From the corridor window, she watched him cross the lobby. Creed was there, sitting now in one of the waiting chairs, elbows on his knees, looking at the floor. Caulfield passed within 15 feet of him without stopping or looking. Creed didn't look up. At 5:15, Marfeld came to the trauma floor. She went directly to the nursing station and asked for a few minutes. They used the small consultation room at the end of the hall. 4 chairs, 1 table, no window. Marfeld closed the door. I owe you a longer conversation than this, Marfeld said. But I want to say something today before it becomes tomorrow and gets processed into institutional language. She paused. Phillip Creed has been here 11 years. He built the ER program, expanded the trauma unit, managed through 4 administrators before me. He was very good at being visible in exactly the right ways. She stopped. And he used that visibility to cause significant harm to people who were doing their jobs correctly, including you. She met Lena's eyes. I should have seen it sooner. I didn't. That's on me. Lena said, You opened the internal review. After Caulfield pushed, not before. You didn't close it when Creed escalated to the board. No, but I should have been looking before an OIG inquiry was what finally made things move. Marfeld's voice stayed even, not self-flagellating, just accurate, the tone of someone taking a clear-eyed inventory. I want to start a conversation about what this department looks like going forward, not today, when things settle. But I want you to know that conversation is coming and your input in it isn't optional. It's central. What does that mean concretely? Lena said. The trauma lead position posts in 30 days. The supply chain oversight process is being restructured with nursing input at every stage. I'm commissioning an independent review of every staff complaint and disciplinary action filed in this department in the past 3 years. Marfeld paused. And the Veteran Emergency Program, the K9 rehabilitation component especially, you'll have a role in designing it if you want that. Lena thought about what she wanted, which was not a question she usually had time for. I want the supply chain fixed first, she said. It's in motion. OIG is taking point. And the other facilities Solis mentioned, above my level, being addressed. Lena nodded. At the door, Marfeld stopped. The board meeting this morning. Creed argued for 20 minutes that the OIG inquiry was motivated by a disgruntled nurse with a personal vendetta. She said it flat, as information. The board chair asked him to provide documentation of any performance concerns or disciplinary actions predating the inquiry. A pause. He produced your 2 promotion rejections, neither of which included documented clinical grounds, and the complaint he filed yesterday, which I had already formally rejected. She paused again. That was the totality of his documented case against you. She left. Lena sat in the consultation room alone for a moment longer. 2 promotion rejections and a rejected complaint. That was 3 years of being deliberately managed, reduced to a folder that wouldn't have convinced anyone examining it carefully. She thought about the 11 forms, the 19 months, the habit she had built from the second time a form had vanished from the system, which she had never framed to herself as anything except professional due diligence. She had not been building a case, she had been doing her job. The case had assembled itself. She worked through to end of shift, clocked out at 6:03. She was in the stairwell when her phone buzzed. Whitfield. Creed retained counsel at 17:30. Attorney has requested a cooperation meeting with OIG tomorrow morning. Also, Creed filed a complaint with the State Medical Licensing Board, alleging unauthorized medical practice during the ambulance bay response. She read it on the landing between floors, then kept walking. She sent back, I have documentation of every action I took, clinical reasoning on each decision, witnessed by Webb, Brandt, and Caulfield. Whitfield. We know. The licensing complaint goes nowhere. Telling you so, you're not surprised. She pocketed the phone and pushed through the door into the first-floor corridor. The licensing board complaint was a last-move tactic, the move of someone who had lost the larger fight and was creating peripheral damage on the way down. Not because it would succeed, but because defending it cost her something and filing it cost him almost nothing. She recognized it as a tactic rather than a threat. Recognizing it as a tactic meant she could allocate the correct amount of energy toward it, which was very little. She was almost at the main entrance when a woman she didn't know stepped away from the wall near the door. Early 40s, dark coat, civilian, red at the edges of her eyes in the way that could be cold air or something else. Ms. Voss? She said. Lena looked at her. I'm Petra's sister. A pause. Petra Vasek. She was in the loading bay yesterday. The one the dog found. The kitchen worker, femur fracture, the woman who had been certain she was dying. Is she okay? Lena said. She had surgery this morning, the leg. The woman's composure was recently assembled and not yet tested. She wanted me to find you. She said you were the one who told her she wasn't going to die, and she said the way you said it, she believed you. A pause. She said most people would have tried to comfort her. You just told her the truth. Lena looked at this woman, sitting room chairs for a day and a half, her sister in surgery, coming to find a nurse she'd never met because of 4 minutes in a debris field. Tell her I'm glad she's doing well, Lena said, and that the dog deserves more credit than I do. Petra's sister almost laughed, almost cried, did something briefly in between and then pulled herself back together. She said you'd say something like that, the woman said. She left. Lena stood in the corridor for a moment, then went through the main entrance and drove home in the dark with the window down, cold air moving through the car, thinking about nothing specific, just the road and the motion and the particular quality of moving through dark space towards something lit. At 8:47 her phone rang. Unknown number, military exchange, different area code than Fort Lassen. She answered. The voice was female, clipped, professional. Ms. Voss, my name is Colonel Ferris. I'm calling from the Inspector General's office, Joint Operations Division. A pause. I want to speak with you directly tonight because tomorrow morning a development in this investigation becomes public record and I want you to have context before it does. Lena set down her tea. What development? She said. Meridian Tactical Solutions. We've been investigating them at the federal level for approximately 8 months, independently of the Harwell inquiry. The Harwell connection, the specific contract irregularities, represent the third instance of this pattern we've identified. The first 2 involve military procurement, not VA facilities. She paused. Phillip Creed is not the principal in this operation. He is a local facilitator. The principal is a person inside Meridian's executive structure, and that person has been attempting to liquidate their position in the company for the past 6 weeks. They're trying to exit before the investigation reaches them, Lena said. They've partially succeeded. What they couldn't exit cleanly was a specific set of records that the Harwell discrepancy documentation pointed directly toward. Ferris paused. Your documentation, Ms. Voss? The originals. The ones Solis retained. When our team cross-referenced your flagged lot numbers against Meridian's internal production records we obtained through a separate warrant 3 months ago but couldn't use effectively because we lacked a corroborating paper trail from the facility side, it created a complete evidentiary chain. Lena was very still. Your documentation closed the chain, Ferris said, and tomorrow morning a federal arrest warrant is being executed at an address in Denver. I'm telling you tonight because this will generate significant press attention. The Harwell component will be part of that coverage. Your name will appear in the context of the supply discrepancy reports. I want you to be prepared. Lena looked at her kitchen, the plant on the counter she'd had for 2 years and never moved to a better window, which had adjusted to the light it had rather than needing more. Who is the principal? She said. Ferris told her. A name Lena didn't recognize. She had only ever seen the bottom floor of the structure this person sat above. But it meant something anyway. The way the names of things you've been circling without knowing it mean something when you finally hear them out loud. I'd also like someone present with you tomorrow morning, Ferris said. Not for protection. When the arrest warrant executes, we'll be making public statements about the evidentiary basis of the investigation. We want someone who can speak to the Harwell documentation chain accurately on record. I have a shift at 7, Lena said. The warrant executes at 6. You'll be done before 7. All right. She paused. Is there something else? A beat. Yes, Ferris said. We found something in Meridian's internal communications. Messages between their executive team and Creed, going back 22 months. She paused. There is one message, sent 14 months ago, that references you by name. It describes you as a monitoring risk and discusses options for addressing that risk. Her voice was careful, exact. One of the options discussed was termination, not employment termination. The kitchen was very quiet. Say that again, Lena said. It was discussed, Ferris said. There is no evidence it was acted upon or seriously pursued beyond the message exchange, but it exists in the record, and you will be made formally aware of it tomorrow. I wanted you to hear it from me first. And Creed? Was included in the message thread. He did not respond to that specific option. A pause. But he did not object to it. The silence that followed had a different quality than the other silences of the day. It was the silence of a fact settling into permanent residence, the kind that changes the shape of everything around it without moving anything. I'll be available at 6, Lena said. She ended the call. She sat at her kitchen table and looked at the plant on the counter. The one that had reorganized itself toward whatever light was available, had adapted without complaint to the spot she'd put it without thinking, and she held the weight of what she'd just been told until the weight became something she could carry rather than something carrying her. Then she picked up her phone and called Bev. Bev answered on the second ring. She'd been awake. I need you to know something before tomorrow, Lena said, because tomorrow is going to be complicated, and I'd rather you hear it from me. Bev said, Tell me. Lena told her. Not all of it. The message about termination she kept to herself for now, because that piece still had sharp edges, and she hadn't decided how to handle the sharpness yet. But the rest she laid out cleanly. Meridian, the federal investigation, the arrest warrant, her documentation as the evidentiary link that had closed the chain. When she finished, Bev was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, You kept those forms for 2 years. Yes. From habit. From pattern recognition, Lena said. I saw the same type of discrepancy recurring across different supply deliveries. I documented it because that's what you do with recurring patterns. Another pause. Lena. Bev's voice had shifted, quieter, more deliberate. I want you to hear something. Before tomorrow turns all of this into a procedure. She seemed to organize her words carefully. You spent 3 years in a department run by a man who understood exactly how capable you were and used that understanding to keep you small. Who gave you the hardest tasks with the least authority, who rejected your applications without documented grounds, who put you in a room with 3 military dogs hoping something would go wrong, and when it didn't, filed a complaint against you anyway. She paused. And you didn't collapse. You didn't leave. You didn't let it make you bitter or sloppy. You just kept doing your job correctly, every single shift, and you documented everything, and you waited. A pause. And now a federal arrest is happening tomorrow because of paperwork you did in your own time from professional habit, because you believed what you were seeing mattered even when no one was confirming that it did. Lena said nothing. I just want you to know that I see that, Bev said. Before tomorrow makes it into something else. Lena looked at the wall above the kitchen table, the blank space she'd been meaning to do something with for 3 years. Get some sleep, she said. I'll see you at 7. She ended the call. She sat for a while longer, then got up, moved the plant from the counter to the east-facing windowsill, the one that would get the morning light, and went to bed. She was already awake when the alarm went off at 5:43. She dressed, drank coffee at the counter, picked up her bag. The manila envelope sat on the bedside table. The originals, which the OIG had copies of, which she would hand over formally today through the proper channel with proper documentation. She was locking her front door when her phone buzzed. Whitfield. Creed's attorney contacted OIG at 2200 last night. Creed is requesting a cooperation agreement. She read it once, put the phone in her pocket, and walked to her car. The cooperation request was not surprising. It was the move of a man who had calculated that his position was worse standing alone than it was offering something in exchange for consideration. Whether that calculation was correct depended on what he actually had to offer, which was Ferris's problem now. She drove to Harwell in the early dark, parked on level 2, took the stairs. On the first floor, she pushed through the stairwell door and stopped. The corridor was not empty. Major Caulfield stood outside the K9 holding room in full uniform, and beside him was a woman she recognized from the previous night's phone call, Colonel Ferris, in person now, compact and composed in the specific way of someone for whom composure was not an effort, but a baseline. 2 plainclothes agents flanked them, their civilian clothes doing the thing civilian clothes did on federal agents, which was nothing quite right. The holding room door was open. Delta was in the doorway watching her. Then Sable moved into view beside him. Then Rex, stepping forward to the threshold with the fixed, patient attention of an animal who had waited through a long night and was now oriented toward what came next. Caulfield looked at her across the corridor. We need you in the building when the warrant executes, he said. Ferris needs your statement on the documentation chain before the press release goes out. She called me last night, Lena said. I know. There's something else. Caulfield's voice changed. Not in volume, but in register. The way voices change when the next sentence is going to reframe the previous hour. Something we found this morning that changes the scope. Lena looked at him. The Meridian Principle, he said. The one Ferris told you about last night. The warrant target. He paused. He's not in Denver. The corridor was very quiet. He was there 6 weeks ago, Caulfield continued. He's been moving since. Our people tracked him to 3 locations before the trail went cold late last night. He paused. 40 minutes ago, we got a confirmed location. Where? She said. Colorado Springs. He held her gaze. He's been here for 4 days. And this morning at 0400, he accessed Harwell's external network using a credential that should have been deactivated 8 months ago. Lena went very still. He was in the system, she said. He may still be in the system, Caulfield said, and we don't yet know what he accessed or what he was looking for. Rex took one deliberate step forward into the corridor and stopped, his body oriented toward Lena with the precision of an animal that has made a decision about where it is needed. Lena looked at the 3 dogs, at Caulfield, at Ferris, who was watching her with the particular attention of someone who had decided several hours ago what they needed from this person and was waiting to find out if they'd been right. What do you need me to do? Lena said. Ferris stepped forward. The credential he used to access the network, she said. It's registered to a former Harwell employee. It was supposed to be deactivated as part of standard offboarding. She paused. It wasn't, which means either someone failed to follow deactivation protocol or someone deliberately left it active. Lena said, Whose credential? Ferris looked at her steadily. Adria Solis, she said. The name landed in the corridor with a weight that rearranged everything around it. Lena looked at Caulfield, at Ferris, at the two plainclothes agents who were watching her with the careful neutrality of people waiting for a reaction that would tell them something. Adria talked to you last night for 47 minutes, Lena said slowly. She named the executive structure. She named the shell entities. She gave you the documents. She paused. And 4 hours later, someone used her credential to access this hospital's network. Yes, Ferris said. You're not sure she's the source of the breach. No, Ferris said. We're not sure. But you're sure the credential access happened. The access log is confirmed. Lena thought about Adria's voice on the speakerphone, the rehearsed steadiness, the careful precision of someone who had spent 11 months building toward a single decision, the genuine texture of someone afraid. The way she had said, I needed to know someone like that was in the room. She thought about what it would mean if that had been real, and she thought about what it would mean if it hadn't been. Does Adria know the principal is in Colorado Springs? Lena said. Ferris said, that information was not shared with her. But she spoke to your team for 47 minutes last night about the structure of the operation, including the executive contact points. Lena paused. If she reported that conversation to someone, they would know the investigation was closer than they thought. Yes, Ferris said quietly. They would. Rex had not moved from his position at the threshold. His attention hadn't shifted. He was watching Lena with the steadiness of an animal that understood more about the room than most of the people in it. Lena said, what's in the section of the hospital system he accessed? Ferris opened a folder and held out a single page. Lena took it. It was a system access log, timestamp 0417, external IP, the credential string, and the specific database section that had been reached before the access terminated at 0422. 5 minutes. Enough time to look at something specific if you knew where it was. The section was personnel records. Specifically, the personnel record of one current Harwell staff member, accessed at OH419. The name on the access record was hers. Lena held the page for a moment, then handed it back. He was looking at me, she said. At your employment record, Ferris said. Your address on file. Your shift schedule. She paused. Your emergency contacts. The morning was very quiet around them. The hospital not yet fully awake, the corridor lit in the flat fluorescent way of early institutional hours before natural light reached the interior spaces. Lena looked at the page one more time, then at Ferris. The warrant, she said. It was supposed to execute in Denver at 6 o'clock. We redirected it at 0450, Ferris said. Colorado Springs. We're executing here, she paused. But we don't have a confirmed location within the city yet. We have a cell signal triangulation that puts him within a 2-mile radius of this hospital. The 2-mile radius of this hospital. Lena looked at the holding room door, at Rex, still at the threshold, still watching her. Then she looked at Caulfield. Rex indicated a secondary casualty in the loading bay yesterday, she said, from a position that none of the human responders had reached. He found someone invisible to everyone else in the space. Caulfield said, yes. She looked at Ferris. You said you don't have a confirmed location within the city. Ferris's eyes sharpened slightly. These dogs, Lena said carefully, have operational search history across 3 deployments. Rex specifically has confirmed structural search experience in complex environments. She paused. What you need right now is a search asset with a known track record in compressed time frames in a facility environment, with a handler the animals will respond to without hesitation. The corridor was very still. Ferris looked at Caulfield. Caulfield looked at Lena for a long moment, the look of someone confirming something they had already privately concluded. You understand what you're suggesting, he said. I understand exactly what I'm suggesting, she said. Rex stepped fully into the corridor and sat at her left side. Lena looked down at him, then back at Ferris. What's the 2-mile radius centered on, she said. Ferris said, this building. Ferris made the decision in under 30 seconds, which was faster than most people made decisions of that magnitude, and Lena respected her for it. You stay within radio contact at all times, Ferris said. You do not approach a confirmed subject location. You indicate, you hold, you wait for my people. She looked at Caulfield. Major. Understood, Caulfield said. He was already moving toward the holding room. The next 4 minutes were organized chaos of the specific kind Lena had learned to move inside. Tasks happening in parallel, People taking positions without being told twice. The particular compression of time that arrived when a situation had a hard edge and everyone present understood it. Ferris pulled her two plainclothes agents into a tight briefing. Caulfield got the dogs harnessed and checked their working vests with the efficiency of someone who had done it in worse conditions than a hospital corridor at 6 in the morning. Lena was handed an earpiece and a radio clipped to her scrub collar and given a 30-second orientation by one of the agents, channels, signals, the specific call that meant stop and hold position and do not move until cleared. She put the earpiece in, checked the radio, nodded. Rex pressed against her left leg. Delta and Sable were positioned beside Caulfield, who would work the exterior perimeter with Ferris's team. The building search was Lena and Rex, with one of the plainclothes agents, the younger one, Dara, who she already knew, staying within 10 feet of her at all times. He accessed the personnel database at 0419, Ferris said. 5 minutes, then the session terminated. Either he found what he wanted or something interrupted him. She paused. If he's in the building, he came in before the system logged his access, which means before 4 in the morning. He's had 2 hours. What does he look like? Lena said. Ferris handed her a photograph. 53, gray at the temples. The build of someone who had once been physically substantial and had not maintained it. The photograph was a corporate headshot, the kind taken for a board profile, the kind designed to communicate trustworthiness in the specific way that a certain type of man communicated it, which was through the appearance of having nothing to hide. She looked at it for 3 seconds, then handed it back. Where do we start? Dara said. Lena thought about the hospital's layout. She'd worked in it for 3 years. She knew it the way you knew a building you moved through every day without consciously mapping it, in texture and rhythm, in the pattern of which spaces were occupied at which hours, where the dead zones were, where the warmth and light gathered, and where the building went cold and institutional at its edges. A man who had accessed a personnel database needed either a device connected to the hospital's external network or access to a terminal inside the building. The external access log had shown him coming in remotely at 0417, which meant either he had been remote, outside the building, on a device, or he had used the hospital's own infrastructure from inside, routing through an external proxy to mask the origin. Basement, she said. Server infrastructure is sub-level 2. There are 3 terminal stations down there for the facilities management team. They're unmanned between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. Dara looked at Ferris. Ferris nodded once. They moved. Boy. The hospital's sub-basement had the quality of all sub-basements. Lower ceilings, fluorescent lighting that hummed at a frequency the upper floors had been spared, the smell of concrete and climate-controlled air that had been recirculated too many times. Lena had been down here twice in 3 years, both times tracking supply deliveries that had been logged as received but hadn't appeared on the floor inventory. Both times she'd been right that the discrepancy was real, and both times the paperwork had gone nowhere. The irony of that was not lost on her. Rex moved ahead of her on the lead, not pulling, just directing, his nose working the air in the particular way she remembered from operational environments, the way that meant he had something and was tracking the gradient of it. She let him set the pace. Dara was 3 feet to her right, hand near his jacket, not drawing, waiting. The sub-basement had 3 corridors branching from the main elevator lobby. Rex bypassed the first 2 without slowing. At the third, he checked, back 2 steps, then moved forward with the increased certainty of an animal that had resolved a question he'd been working on. She keyed her radio. 3rd corridor, sub-basement. Rex is indicating. Ferris, in her ear. Copy. Hold at corridor entrance. Lena stopped. Rex stopped with her. His body was rigid with the controlled tension of a working dog at the edge of a confirmed indication. The tension that was not aggression, but was its direct neighbor. They waited 40 seconds. Then Ferris's voice. 2 agents entering the building through the service entrance. 90 seconds. Lena looked down the corridor. It was approximately 40 meters, lit by overhead panels. 3 doors on the left side. The first was labeled Facilities, HVAC. The second was labeled Server Room A, Authorized Access Only. The third was labeled Server Room B. The second door had a thin line of light at its base. She keyed her radio again. Server Room A, light under the door. A pause. Ferris, hold position. Dara had seen it too. He shifted his weight forward slightly, then made himself stop. They held position for 93 seconds. Then two agents came around the corner from the service entrance direction, different people than the ones upstairs, which meant Ferris had more personnel in the building than she'd disclosed initially, which was exactly what Lena would have done in her position. The four of them moved to the door. One of the agents, a woman, compact, moving with the practiced quiet of someone who did this regularly, put her ear to the door for 2 seconds, then held up a single finger. One person inside, the agents positioned. Dara moved Lena back 3 steps and held that position with his body between her and the door, which was protocol, and she didn't argue with it. The door opened. Lena didn't see the arrest itself. Dara was in the way, and the angle was wrong. What she heard was a voice she didn't recognize saying something sharp and defensive, and then the specific sounds of a physical restraint being applied to someone who had decided at the last second to resist and had discovered almost immediately that the decision was wrong, and then quiet. Then Ferris's voice in her ear. "Subject in custody. Sub-basement server room A. We're clear." Rex sat down beside her left foot. She exhaled slowly and looked at the ceiling of the sub-basement corridor. Concrete, painted gray, a water stain in one corner that had been there long enough to become a permanent feature. And she stood there for a moment just breathing, because that was what you did after the thing resolved, before the next thing began. Dara said, "You okay?" "Yes," she said. "You sure?" "I'm sure." She looked at Rex. "Good boy." Rex's tail moved once. Then he looked toward the server room door, patient and alert, waiting to see what came next. What came next was paperwork, which was the way most significant things ended in Lena's experience, and she found that appropriate. The subject, the Meridian principal, whose name she now knew to be Warren Aldrich, was transported out of the building through the service entrance at 6:22. He did not look at Lena as he passed. She was standing in the lobby corridor and he was being moved quickly, and the agents on either side of him were not giving him angles to look at things. But she saw his face in the second before he was through the door. Pale, compressed, the face of a man who had made a series of calculations over 14 months and had just discovered the margin of error in all of them. He had come to the hospital, she understood now, because the network access had told him what he'd needed to know. The documentation trail led here, and the person most likely to give testimony that would close the evidentiary chain was on the employee roster with a shift starting at 7. He had come to find out what she knew, or to find a way to make sure she couldn't say it, or some combination of both that he hadn't fully worked out yet. Instead, he had spent 2 hours in a server room and found a federal arrest warrant waiting on the other side of the door. Ferris found Lena in the lobby at 6:31. "Press statement goes out at 8, she said. "We need your formal statement before then. Can you give us 45 minutes? "Yes," Lena said. "After that, you're free. The licensing board complaint from Creed. We'll be filing a counter-notification with the board documenting the retaliatory context. Combined with Webb and Brandt's written accounts, it goes nowhere." "I know," Lena said. Ferris looked at her for a moment. Not the assessing look she'd been using since the parking lot the previous evening. Something slightly different. The look of someone who had formed a conclusion and was deciding whether to say it. "In my experience," Ferris said, "the cases that matter aren't the ones where someone does something extraordinary under pressure. Those are easier to recognize. The cases that matter are the ones where someone does something ordinary, correct, careful, unremarkable, over and over again for months or years in an environment designed to make them stop." She paused. "Those are the ones that are hardest to sustain and the hardest to see." She left to coordinate the press logistics. Lena stood in the lobby for a moment longer. Through the main entrance doors, the Colorado morning was becoming visible. Not sunrise yet, but the particular gray-blue of sky that was a few minutes ahead of it, light arriving before the source of it was visible. She had 45 minutes before her formal statement. She had a shift starting at 7. She went to find coffee. The formal statement took 38 minutes. She delivered it in the same administrative conference room where she'd met Whitfield and Dara 2 evenings before. The room with the pitcher of water nobody had touched. Whitfield was there again, and Dara with his notebook, and a court reporter she hadn't met before who typed without looking at the keys. She went through every supply discrepancy form in chronological order, giving dates, lot numbers, clinical reasoning, submission method, and the follow-up she had and hadn't received for each one. She was precise about what she knew from direct observation and careful about the line between that and inference. When they asked her to characterize Creed's intent, she said she could speak to patterns of behavior and documented actions, but not to intent, which was accurate and which she held to even when Whitfield pushed twice. When it was done, Whitfield said, "This will be entered into the federal record and referenced in the public statement." "Okay," she said, "your name will be in the statement." "I know. Some people prefer—" "My name is fine," she said. "I'm not ashamed of anything I did." He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "I wouldn't think so." She was on the trauma floor at 7:04, which was 4 minutes later than she preferred, and Bev was at the nursing station with the expression of someone who had been awake since before the sun and had processed several significant pieces of information in that time and was managing the combination of them imperfectly. "You were in the basement," Bev said, "at 6 in the morning. With federal agents and a military working dog," Lena said. "Yes." Bev stared at her. "I'll explain later," Lena said. "What's the status on Briggs?" Bev blinked. Shifted modes. Overnight was stable. Morning antibiotic administered at 6:45. Confirmed. I checked personally. The imaging order is in the queue. Good. Who else needs attention first? And they went to work. The press statement went out at 8:07. By 8:15, 3 nurses on the floor had seen it on their phones, and there was a particular quality to the air on the trauma unit, the specific hum of a shared piece of information moving through a space full of people who had opinions about it. Nobody approached Lena directly about it during her morning rounds, but she felt the shift in how she moved through the floor. Not deference, not performance, just the subtle adjustment of a room that is recalibrated around a person it had underestimated. She noticed it and kept working. At 9:30, Dr. Sylvia Brandt appeared on the floor and asked for Lena at the nursing station. Brandt was not a person who made social calls. She was a trauma attending with 17 years of practice, and the kind of directness that some people experienced as coldness, and that Lena had always experienced as respect. When Brandt spoke to you, she was saying exactly what she meant, and the absence of padding meant you didn't have to sort through anything. They stood in the corridor outside room 208. "I gave my written account to the board yesterday," Brandt said, "and to Ferris's team this morning after the statement went out." She paused. "I want you to know what I said about the ambulance bay. You don't have to—" "I said that your triage assessment was correct, your framework was appropriate for the circumstances, your clinical reasoning was sound, and your handoff was the cleanest I've received from a non-attending responder in 11 years of trauma practice at this hospital." She said it the way Brandt said everything, directly, without inflection designed to make it feel like more or less than it was. "I also said that if the trauma-led position had been awarded on documented clinical merit, rather than whatever Creed was using to make those decisions, you would have held it 18 months ago." Lena looked at her. "I should have said something sooner," Brandt said. "I saw the pattern. I told myself it was administration's problem." She paused. "It wasn't only administration's problem." Lena said, "You said something now." "Late." "Still counts," Lena said. Brandt looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "Army medics used to say that?" Lena almost laughed. Brandt left. What? By noon, 3 significant things had happened beyond the arrest. The first was that Harwell's board had convened an emergency session at 10 o'clock and had voted to formally suspend Creed's medical privileges pending the outcome of the federal investigation and the internal review. The suspension was not temporary administrative leave. It was a formal privileges action, which went into the licensing board record and would remain there regardless of how the broader case resolved. His attorney had filed an objection within the hour. The objection was noted and set aside. The second was that the OIG's press statement had been picked up by 4 Colorado media outlets and 1 national healthcare trade publication by 11:30. The coverage was factual and followed the statement closely. Procurement fraud, VA-affiliated facilities, federal arrest, evidentiary documentation trail originating from Harwell nursing staff. Lena's name appeared 3 times. The stories didn't make her the protagonist the way the K9 element of the previous day's events had made her visible to the hospital's internal gossip chain. The press coverage was more specific than that. It named the documentation pattern, it named the duration, and it named the institutional failure that had allowed the pattern to continue unaddressed for 14 months. The third thing was that Adria Solis called. Lena took the call in the stairwell, the same stairwell she'd used twice now for things that needed a quiet space. She sat on the landing between floors and answered. Adria said, "The credential breach. I need you to know. I didn't give him access. I didn't even know he was in Colorado Springs." Lena said, "I know." "You know?" "Your credential wasn't deactivated on schedule. That's an institutional failure, not yours. The access log came from an external proxy. He had your credential from when you left Harwell. Ferris confirmed it this morning." A pause. "She didn't tell me that." "She told me. I'm telling you." Lena paused. "You did the right thing. 11 months is a long time to carry something alone." Adria was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had a different texture, the kind that arrived when pressure released from a direction a person hadn't realized they were braced against. "I kept thinking I should have come forward sooner, that I was a coward." "You came forward when you had enough to make it stick," Lena said. "There's a difference between cowardice and strategy." Another pause. "The woman on the forms," Adria said. "The one who kept submitting them. I used to wonder if she knew what she was looking at." "I didn't know what I was looking at," Lena said honestly. "I knew something was wrong. I documented it because that's what you do with things that are wrong, even when you don't know the full shape of them yet." Adria said, "Is that enough? Just doing that? When nobody's confirming it matters?" Lena thought about that. About 3 years of quiet mornings in supply rooms, cross-referencing specifications against inventory, writing the same type of form over and over and filing it into a system that swallowed it. About the particular discipline required to keep doing a thing correctly when there was no feedback confirming it was being received. "I don't know if it's enough in general," she said. "For me, it was the only option that let me stay in a room with myself." Adria laughed, brief and rough. "Okay. Okay," Lena said. She went back to the floor. The afternoon moved with the particular momentum of a day that had already done most of its significant work by noon and was now settling into the texture of ordinary things that still needed doing, which was most things, most of the time, regardless of what had happened earlier. Harlan Briggs's imaging came back clean. She sat with him for 6 minutes and told him the infection was in retreat and the joint was intact and the next 2 weeks were going to be uncomfortable but manageable. "You're not just saying that," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd learned by now that she didn't just say things. "I'm not just saying that," she confirmed. He nodded slowly. "I heard something happened here last night, this morning, something in the basement." "There was an incident," she said. "It's been resolved." He studied her face the way veterans studied things, looking for the delta between what someone said and what they were actually carrying. "You involved?" "Peripherally," she said. "Uh-huh." He looked at the ceiling. "You know what I always appreciated about good medics? They never needed you to know what they'd done. They just did it and then acted like it was nothing." He paused. "The bad ones always needed you to know." She said nothing. "Just an observation," he said. She patted his arm once. The professional contact of a clinician, not quite the contact of a person, though the line between those things was narrower than most people in her position were comfortable admitting, and left. At 3:45, Marfeld appeared on the trauma floor for the second time in 2 days, which was not something Marfeld did under ordinary circumstances, and which communicated its own information. She brought someone with her, a man in his 60s, civilian suit, the kind of careful posture that came from a long career of representing institutional interests in rooms where institutional interests were contested. He introduced himself as Harwell's board chair. His name was Dr. Emmett Lash, and he had the eyes of someone who had been doing a significant amount of recalculating over the past 18 hours. They used the consultation room again. Lash sat across from Lena and folded his hands on the table in the manner of a man who had prepared what he was going to say and was going to say it regardless of what the preparation felt like now that he was in the room. "I want to be direct with you," Lash said. "Please," she said. "The board reviewed the supply discrepancy documentation this morning in conjunction with the OIG's findings. We also reviewed the complete employment record you've had at Harwell, including the 2 promotion applications you submitted and the grounds on which they were denied. He paused. There were no documented clinical grounds for either denial. The notes from Creed's files, which are now fully accessible to the board, indicate that the denials were based on what he described as fit considerations, without definition. He said it in the tone of a person who has found something in a file and is not going to pretend he isn't troubled by it. There is also documentation, in his internal communications, of his deliberate effort to limit your advancement and professional scope. Over a period of at least 2 years. Lena said nothing. The board has voted, Lash said. Several things are happening simultaneously. First, formal finding of institutional failure in the supply chain oversight process, with a remediation plan that will be developed with input from the nursing staff, specifically from the trauma nursing team. Second, the internal review of disciplinary actions and complaints in the department over the past 3 years, which Marfeld has already initiated, will be completed within 60 days, and any staff members who are impacted by retaliatory actions will be formally notified and their records corrected. He paused. Third, the trauma lead position is being filled, effective on a date to be determined within the next 30 days. Your application from 2 years ago is being reviewed as the active candidate file, not as a historical document. Lena said, I want to apply fresh, not be appointed. Apply. Lash looked at her for a moment. I understand that, he said, and I respect it. The position will be formally posted. You will be invited to apply, along with any other qualified candidates. The review committee will include Brandt and 2 nursing staff members. He paused. But I want you to hear directly from this board that what was done to you in this institution was wrong. Not just procedurally wrong, wrong. He said the word without softening it. You deserve better from the people responsible for this hospital. I'm sorry that you didn't get it. Lena looked at him, then at Marfeld. Marfeld met her eyes and said nothing, which was the right thing to say. Thank you, Lena said, for saying it that way. They left. She sat in the consultation room alone for a moment, the way she'd been doing throughout the past 2 days in small spaces when the air needed to clear. She thought about what it felt like to be told plainly, by the institution that had been the frame of her professional life for 3 years, that the thing she had known to be true was in fact true. She had expected it to feel larger than it did. What it felt like, mostly, was accurate, like a measurement that finally matched what the instrument had been reading all along. She was not, she realized, waiting for permission to know her own value. She hadn't been for a while. The board's acknowledgement mattered. It mattered for the record, for the staff who had watched and said nothing, for the process that would prevent it from happening again. It mattered in those ways. But it didn't determine anything about who she was. She had always known what she was. That was the thing Creed had miscalculated, fundamentally, at the root of all the rest of it. He had managed her as though her sense of herself depended on his recognition of her, as though the absence of the title and the approval and the institutional confirmation was the same as the absence of the capability. It wasn't. It had never been. She went back to the floor. At 5 o'clock, Caulfield found her. He came to the nursing station and stood there until she looked up, and when she did, he said, "Come downstairs when you have a minute." She finished the chart note she was writing, handed a task to the incoming nurse for handoff, and followed him to the elevator. He took her to the ground floor corridor, the K9 holding room. He opened the door. Delta, Sable, and Rex were inside, but not kenneled. They were loose in the room, which meant Caulfield had made a deliberate choice about the configuration of this moment. Rex lifted his head when Lena came through the door. Then he stood up. Then all 3 dogs stood up. "I have something for you," Caulfield said. He reached into the breast pocket of his uniform jacket and produced a document, a single folded page, which he opened and handed to her. It was an official military commendation, her name at the top, the Fort Lassen unit designation below it, a formal citation for her service during 3 specific deployments, dates she recognized, operational designations she was cleared to see written out. The citation described her actions in language that was clipped and formal and military in its precision, which meant it communicated things between the lines that it would never say directly. Things like, this person was trusted completely by people who trusted almost no one. Things like, the outcome of these specific events was better because she was present. At the bottom, Colonel Soren's signature. She read it twice. "This is public record now," she said. "The portions that aren't operationally restricted. Yes. She folded it along its original crease and held it for a moment. She thought about this version of her that had left the military, the one who had carried a weight she hadn't been able to name for a long time, who had become a civilian nurse in a Colorado hospital because she'd needed to care for people without carrying everything else into the room with her. She'd thought of it as retreat at the time. Later, she'd called it recovery. Now she thought maybe it had just been the next correct thing, and the naming of it had mattered less than the doing. "What happens to the dogs?" she said. Caulfield was quiet for a moment. "The rehabilitation program is still active. The pilot continues." He paused. "The program needs a medical lead with both clinical and field experience. Someone who understands what these animals have been through and what the veterans in the program have been through, and who doesn't treat those as separate categories of experience." He paused again. "Marfeld and I spoke this morning. Jointly, we'd like to propose that the role be offered to you, alongside whatever position you take in the trauma department." Lena looked at the three dogs. Delta was watching her with the patient attention of an animal that had made its assessment and was comfortable with the result. Sable had sat down, her damaged rear leg extended at the angle that was easiest for the nerve damage, watching Lena with the calm intelligence she'd shown from the first moment in the evaluation room. Rex was standing 3 feet away, not pressing, not demanding, just present, the way he'd been present in every moment of the past 2 days when the room had needed something steady in it. She said, "The program, it's veterans and dogs together?" "That's the model, working through recovery in parallel. Shared therapy frameworks, physical rehabilitation, reintegration work." He paused. "The research on it is promising, but the program needs someone who can run the medical component without treating either group as secondary." "I'll think about it," she said. "I know," he said. "Take your time." He went to the door and held it, giving her the room. She looked at Rex. He looked at her. She crouched down to his level, not because she needed to, but because it was the right geometry for what she wanted to say, which was not words and didn't need to be. Rex stepped forward and pressed his forehead briefly against hers, just for a second. Then he stepped back and sat, dignified, and waited. She stood up. "Good boy," she said. The same thing she'd said in the sub-basement corridor at 6 in the morning, and it meant the same thing it always meant, which was, "I see you. I know what you did. It mattered." She left. The formal recognition ceremony happened 11 days later. Marfeld organized it. Not a grand event. Nothing that required a podium or an audience arranged in rows. A gathering in the hospital's main conference room, the largest interior space at Harwell, on a Tuesday afternoon. Staff were invited. Most came. The board was represented. Colonel Soren attended in person, which was not something the staff had been told to expect, and which produced a specific quality of attention when he walked in. Lena stood at the front of the room and received 3 things. The first was a formal institutional apology from Lash, read into the record. Not a general statement, but a specific one that named what had been done and by whom and over what period of time, and committed the institution to a series of concrete changes that were already in progress. He read it without inflection, designed to make it easier, which made it harder to hear and more valuable for being so. The second was the military commendation, formally presented by Soren. He read the citation aloud in the flat, carrying voice of a man accustomed to reading citations in outdoor environments in bad weather, and the room was very quiet during it. The third was Marfeld's announcement of Lena's appointment to a newly created position, Trauma Response and Veteran Rehabilitation Coordinator, which combined the clinical oversight of the trauma nursing program with the directorship of the K9 rehabilitation pilot. The trauma lead search was still running, which was correct, because Lena had applied fresh and would be considered on merit with the other candidates, as she'd asked. But the coordination role was hers, and it had been built around the intersection of what she knew and what the hospital needed, and it was not a consolation and did not feel like one. She said thank you to Soren and to Lash. She said specifically that the people who deserved recognition were the ones who had documented correctly and come forward when it mattered, which meant Adria Solis, who was not in the room but was watching via a video link Whitfield had arranged, and Dr. Webb, who was there and who looked at the floor when she mentioned him in a way that communicated he was not comfortable being recognized, and also that the recognition was accurate. She said one more thing. She said it not because the room required it, but because she believed it. and she had been in enough rooms to know the difference between things that were said because they were expected and things that were said because they were true. The hardest thing about doing your job correctly, she said, when the environment around you is telling you that what you're seeing doesn't matter, isn't the work itself. The work is the same regardless of who's watching. The hardest thing is sustaining the belief that accuracy is worth the cost when there's no evidence it's going anywhere. She paused. I kept those forms because I got in a habit, because I'd been trained that documentation mattered, and I didn't stop believing it even when the documentation kept disappearing. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't courage. It was stubbornness. I was too convinced I was right to stop. A small ripple moved through the room. Not laughter exactly. Recognition. But I think that's what most of the quiet, important work actually looks like, she said. Not courage. Just the refusal to accept that wrong things are normal because they happen repeatedly. The discipline to keep recording what you see even when no one confirms it's being received. She stopped. That's not nothing. That's everything. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Bev, from the middle of the room, said, "Okay, but the dog thing was also pretty incredible." The tension broke cleanly. People laughed. Actual laughter. The kind that arrived when a room had been holding something serious for long enough that the release was physical. Lena smiled. She was still smiling when the 3 dogs came in. Nobody had announced it. Caulfield had simply brought them. And when the conference room door opened and Delta came through first, then Sable, and then Rex, the room did something rooms rarely did, which was go completely silent in a way that was not uncomfortable but was the opposite of it. The silence of a large group of people witnessing something they hadn't expected and didn't have words for yet. The dogs walked through the assembled staff with the deliberate calm of animals that had been in more significant rooms than this one and were not impressed by crowds. They ignored Soren. They ignored Lash. They moved past Webb and Brandt and Bev and the board members and the administrative staff and all the people who had arranged the room and organized the moment and had authority over various things. They walked to Lena. Delta stopped on her right, Sable on her left. Rex directly in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. All 3 sat and waited. She knew what they were waiting for. She had been waiting for this moment for years without knowing it. Or rather, she had stopped waiting for it a long time ago because waiting for things you'd left behind was a way of not fully arriving in the place you were. She had arrived. She had been here. She had done the work. And the work, it turned out, had remembered her. She put her right hand on Rex's head. Her left found Delta's. Sable pressed her nose briefly against Lena's palm. The left one, the one that still had a faint line where the butterfly tape had been. "Good to see you, team," she said. It was what she'd said to them years ago at the end of missions. Not a formal command, not a dismissal, an acknowledgement, a recognition that went both directions. "I see you. I know what this cost. We're still here." Rex turned his head slightly and pressed into her hand. The room remained silent for a moment longer. Then Soren, from where he was standing near the back wall, said something quiet to the officer beside him. She didn't catch the words, but she heard Bev, 4 feet away, exhale a long breath and say, very softly, "There it is." In the weeks that followed, several things resolved in the manner of things that have been building for a long time and needed only the right pressure to complete their shape. Warren Aldrich was indicted on 12 counts of federal procurement fraud across 3 states. Creed, who had accepted the cooperation agreement, provided testimony in exchange for a reduced charge, a single count of conspiracy to defraud, which still carried consequences sufficient to end his medical career and his freedom for the following 3 years. The Medical Licensing Board revoked his clinical privileges before the criminal proceedings concluded, which meant the revocation was permanent regardless of how the case ultimately resolved. The board chair's formal letter, which Lena never asked to see and did not need to, went into the public record. The licensing board complaint Creed had filed against Lena was withdrawn by his attorney as part of the cooperation agreement. The withdrawal was documented, and the documentation was attached to her permanent record as a formal clearance. Meridian Tactical Solutions lost its VA contracting eligibility. The 2 other facilities affected by the fraud scheme received corrected equipment deliveries and audit-verified supply chain reviews. The total recovered through the federal process was not everything that had moved through the shell entities, but it was enough to matter. Adria Solis received formal whistleblower protections and a written finding from the OIG that her departure from Harwell had been coerced, a finding that went into a separate personnel record that she could use to correct the professional history the coercion had created. She did not return to hospital administration. She started working for a patient advocacy nonprofit in New Mexico and sent Lena a brief message 6 weeks after the proceedings concluded. It said, "Thank you for being in the room." Lena wrote back, "Thank you for keeping the copies." The trauma lead position was filled. The selection committee, which included Brandt and 2 nursing staff members as Lash had promised, reviewed 4 candidates and made a decision that Lena was not part of because she had removed herself from that search. She had looked at the role as it was defined and then at the coordination position she'd been given, and had understood that the coordination role was where her particular combination of training pointed, not managing a floor, building a program, creating the kind of integrated care environment that treated veterans' physical and psychological histories as inseparable, and that treated military working dogs as patients rather than equipment, because they were patients rather than equipment, and someone needed to make that argument with enough clinical backing to make it stick. She made the argument. It stuck. The pilot program expanded at 6 months to include 2 additional VA-affiliated facilities in the region. Neither of them was Harwell. They were in New Mexico and Wyoming, and Lena traveled to both for the training implementation, which she did without drama and without anyone photographing it for a press release, which was how she preferred things. Rex was formally transferred to the Harwell program at 4 months. Delta and Sable continued their rehabilitation at Fort Lassen, with a transfer review scheduled for 6 months out. On the days Rex was in the building, he moved through the veteran wing with the authority of an animal who had chosen the assignment rather than been given it, which in practical terms looked like him positioning himself wherever the work was and waiting with his particular patient attention for what came next. Every Friday afternoon, Lena walked the veteran wing and Rex walked beside her. It was not a ceremony. It was not designed to be photographed or observed. It was the practical reality of a dog who had decided that this was where he was needed, and a person who had decided the same thing, and the 2 of them moving through the space that was now theirs together, doing the work that needed doing. Bev came to find her one of those Fridays, a late afternoon in November, the light going low and orange through the corridor windows, Rex 2 steps ahead as he always was. Creed's sentencing was today, Bev said. It came through. 3 years, federal facility. Privileges revoked permanently. Lena said, "Okay." Bev fell into step beside her. "That's all? Okay?" Lena thought about the correct answer. "It's what was supposed to happen," she said. "The system worked the way it was supposed to work, eventually." She paused. "I spent a long time being angry at how long eventually took. I don't think I have the anger in the same way anymore." "What do you have instead?" Lena looked down the corridor at the veteran wing, at the rooms with their lit windows, the faces visible through doorways, the quiet business of people working toward something they hadn't expected to work toward. "This," she said simply. Bev walked beside her for a moment. Then she said, "You know what I think the lesson was? In all of this?" "Tell me," Lena said. "That the people who are most dangerous to a corrupt system aren't the ones making noise about it," Bev said. "They're the ones who just keep doing their job correctly no matter what, who document everything, who refuse to let the environment convince them that what they know to be true is actually wrong." She paused. "Because you can ignore noise. You can't ignore a paper trail." Lena considered that. "That's almost right," she said. Bev looked at her. "Almost?" "The documentation matters. But it only mattered because of what it was documenting." Lena paused. "Someone has to actually see the problem first. Someone has to believe the problem is real enough to write down, even when everyone around them is acting like it isn't there." She paused. "That's the harder part. The documentation is just what you do with what you already know." Rex stopped at the entrance to room 214, looked back at Lena, and waited. The veteran inside, a man who had been working through a particularly difficult week, and who had, on 2 separate occasions, responded to Rex's presence with the specific exhale of someone who had stopped holding something they'd been holding for too long, needed his afternoon check. She went in. Rex followed. The work continued, the way work did, the way it always had. Not heroically, not dramatically, not in moments that would be remembered by anyone except the people who needed remembering. Quietly, correctly. One room at a time, that was enough. That had always been enough. It had just taken the right people long enough to notice.